Some men don't die from bullets. They die from silence, from holding in things they should have shouted, from walking past what they should have faced. Mason Hayes knew this truth better than most. Rain lashed against the weathered boards of his ranch house, each drop like a bullet on the tin roof. The storm had rolled in from the west just after sundown, bringing with it the kind of darkness that swallowed lantern light and made a man feel small. Outside, the wind howled through the Arizona pines like a woman mourning. Mason sat at his kitchen table, cleaning his Remington rifle by the dim glow of an oil lamp. His movements were methodical, practiced a ritual performed 1,000 times. The familiar scent of gun oil and wood smoke hung in the air, but tonight it brought him no comfort. Something was wrong. He'd felt it since morning, a coldness in his bones that had nothing to do with the coming storm. 50 years of hard living had taught him to trust that feeling. The first shot shattered his kitchen window. Mason was on the floor before the glass hit the table, rifle in hand, body moving on instinct forged in years of manhunts and gunfights. The second shot splintered wood where his head had been moments before. "Come out, old man," a voice called from the darkness. "We ain't here for much, just what's owed." Mason crawled to the window, keeping below the sill. Through the curtain of rain, he could make out the shapes of two men by his corral. One held a lantern, its glow reflecting off slickers and gun barrels. "Nothing owed here," Mason called back. "Just a man trying to live quiet." Laughter cut through the storm. "That what you think boss says different?" Mason didn't respond. Instead, he moved to the back door, easing it open without a sound. The rain hit him immediately, soaking through his shirt, plastering his gray hair to his skull. He circled wide around the house, keeping to the shadows, mud sucking at his boots. The first man never saw him coming. Mason brought the rifle butt down hard against the back of his skull, dropping him face first into the mud. The second man turned, pistol rising, but too slow. Mason's shot echoed across the valley, momentarily drowning out the thunder. The man stumbled backward, clutching his chest before collapsing beside the corral fence. In the sudden silence that followed, Mason approached cautiously, rifle trained on the fallen figures. The first man was unconscious but breathing. The second wouldn't draw breath again in this world. Mason knelt beside the dead man, turning him over. Nothing remarkable, just another hard-faced drifter with a week's growth of beard and calloused hands. But as Mason checked for identification, he pushed up the man's sleeve and froze. There on the inside of the wrist was a crude tattoo, the letters RKD in faded blue ink. Mason's world narrowed to those three letters, the storm and night fading to a distant roar. His hand trembled as he touched the mark, a brand he hadn't seen in 5 years. A brand he'd hoped never to see again. "Impossible," he whispered, his voice lost in the rain. The memories he'd fought so hard to bury surged back like floodwaters breaking through a dam. The screams, the blood. Elizabeth's face still and pale in death. Mason staggered to his feet, suddenly aware of how exposed he was. If these men were RKDs, there would be more. There were always more. He dragged the unconscious man into his barn and secured him with rope. Questions would come later. The dead man he left where he fell, a message for whoever might come looking. Back inside, Mason moved with purpose. From beneath a loose floorboard under his bed, he retrieved a wooden box, its surface worn smooth from years of handling. Inside lay his past, a U.S. Marshal's badge tarnished with age, and a folded letter of resignation dated April 18, 1880. Beneath these, wrapped in oilcloth, was a Colt Peacemaker, his service weapon untouched since the day he'd walked away. Mason unwrapped the revolver, feeling its familiar weight. He checked the cylinder, still loaded as he'd left it. Some part of him had always known this day would come. As he slid the Peacemaker into his holster, lightning split the sky, illuminating the small photograph on his bedside table, Elizabeth, in her nurse's uniform, smiling forever, 33 years old, forever untouched by what would come. "They're back, Lizzie," he whispered to the photograph. "God help me, they're back." Dawn broke clear and cold after the storm, the sky washed clean of clouds. Mason rode his property line, alert for signs of intrusion. 5 years of ranching hadn't dulled his tracking skills. He spotted the hoof prints immediately cutting across his south pasture toward the creek. 4 riders moving fast. Not the 2 from last night, these tracks were fresher. Mason followed them to the creek's edge where they'd paused to water their horses. The ground told its story to his practiced eye. They'd stayed only long enough to drink, then continued east toward his property line. But something caught his attention, a disturbance in the mud near a stand of cottonwoods. Mason dismounted, rifle ready, and approached cautiously. At first, he thought it was a fallen branch caught in the low-hanging limbs. But as he drew closer, he saw it was a burlap sack, crudely tied, swinging gently in the morning breeze. Mason's heart quickened. Something about it felt wrong, too, still too deliberate. He approached slowly, eyes scanning the tree line for any sign of ambush. The sack wasn't tied tight, more thrown and caught halfway. Mason could see dark stains near the bottom, still wet in the morning light. Then he heard it, a sound so faint he almost missed it. A breath, weak but human. Mason cut the sack down with his knife and laid it gently on the ground. When he opened it, his breath caught in his throat. Inside was a woman, perhaps 30, her face bruised and swollen. Her dress was torn, her skin dry and blistered from exposure. Her lips were cracked and bleeding, and one wrist was still bound with rusted wire that had cut deep into her flesh. She was alive, but barely. Her eyes fluttered open as he leaned closer, deep blue eyes glazed with pain, but still alert. She looked at him for a long moment, recognition flickering across her face. "You're late, Hayes," she whispered, her voice a dry rasp. Too late. Then her eyes closed and she went limp in his arms. Mason froze, shock coursing through him. She knew his name. This woman, this stranger left for dead on his land, knew who he was. With gentle hands, he lifted her from the sack and placed her on his horse. Whatever connection they had, whatever danger she brought with her, he couldn't leave her to die. Not here. Not like this. As he mounted behind her, supporting her unconscious form, Mason scanned the horizon. Whoever had left her here might still be watching, might be waiting to see what he would do. Let them watch, he thought grimly. Let them come. He turned his horse toward home, the woman's head lolling against his chest, her breathing shallow, but steady. The morning sun cast their shadow long across the ground, a single silhouette against the vast Arizona landscape. Some men don't die from bullets, Mason knew. Some men are brought back to life by the very things that should destroy them. The woman lay unconscious on Mason's bed, her breathing labored but steady. He'd cleaned her wounds as best he could, the cuts on her wrist, the bruises that bloomed across her skin like dark flowers. He'd had practice tending wounds in his former life, though Elizabeth had been the one with true healing hands. "What am I supposed to do with you?" he asked the silent figure. 5 years of solitude had made him unaccustomed to company, especially the kind that arrived in a burlap sack with his name on her lips. The nearest doctor was in Tucson, a day's ride away. Even if he could leave her alone that long, bringing a doctor would mean questions. Questions he wasn't prepared to answer. As he dabbed a cool cloth across her forehead, his fingers brushed against something in the pocket of her torn dress. Carefully, he reached inside and pulled out a folded photograph, its edges worn and creased from handling. Mason unfolded it slowly, then felt the world shift beneath him. The photograph showed a group of medical staff outside a field hospital tent, army uniforms and nurses in white. Elizabeth stood in the center, her face serious but kind, as always. And beside her, younger by decades and with both arms intact, stood Mason himself. This was impossible. The photograph had been taken during the war nearly 20 years ago. How could this woman have it? "I see you found my insurance." The voice, weak but determined, startled him. The woman's eyes were open, watching him with a clarity that belied her condition. "Who are you?" Mason asked, his voice harder than he intended. She tried to sit up, wincing with the effort. Mason moved to help her, but she waved him off, pride evident in the set of her jaw. "Eleanor Reed," she said, settling back against the pillows. "Sister of Margaret Reed. You might remember her, one of the women you failed to save 5 years ago." The words hit Mason like a physical blow. Margaret Reed, he remembered the name from the case files. One of 7 women abducted by RKD's gang. One of 7 they'd failed to rescue. One of 7 whose fate remained unknown after the botched raid that had cost Elizabeth her life. "How did you find you?" Eleanor finished for him. "It wasn't easy. You disappeared quite thoroughly, Marshal Hayes. Or should I just call you Mason now?" Mason stood, putting distance between them. His mind raced. If she had found him, others could too. "Why are you here? What do you want from me?" Eleanor's laugh was bitter, ending in a cough that shook her slender frame. "Right now, water would be nice." Mason filled a cup from the pitcher on his bedside table and helped her drink. She took small sips, her eyes never leaving his face. "I didn't come looking for you," she said finally. "Not specifically. I was investigating RKD, trying to find Margaret, or at least learn what happened to her. I got careless. They caught me 3 weeks ago." "You're a lawman?" Mason asked, skepticism evident in his voice. "A nurse, and a writer for the Tucson Star." Pride flashed in her eyes. "I've been gathering evidence against Raymond Dawson for 3 years. Names, dates, locations, witness testimonies, enough to hang him 10 times over." "And what good did it do you?" Mason gestured to her injuries. "Look what they did to you." "They've done worse to others," she replied, her voice steady. "To Margaret. To your wife." Mason turned away, unable to bear the accusation in her gaze. "My wife is not your concern." "No. Then why do I know her name was Elizabeth? Why do I know she died because someone in your team betrayed you to RKD? Why do I know you've been hiding out here writing letters to a dead woman while Dawson continues to destroy lives?" Mason spun back, anger flaring. "You know nothing about me or Elizabeth." "I know more than you think," Eleanor countered. "Margaret worked with Elizabeth at the Prescott Hospital before she was taken. She spoke of her often in her letters, of her kindness, her dedication." The fight went out of Mason, suddenly leaving him hollow. He sank into the chair beside the bed. "Why are you here, Miss Reed? What do you want from me?" Eleanor's expression softened slightly. "I didn't come looking for you," she repeated. "I was investigating a new operation of Dawson's, a training camp for young men near the border. They caught me watching them. When they found my notes, they decided to make an example of me." She touched her wounded wrist where the wire had cut deep. "They knew who I was, Margaret's sister. They wanted information about what I'd discovered, who I'd told. When I wouldn't give it to them, they—" She swallowed hard. They decided I wasn't worth keeping. They were taking me to the border to dispose of me when I managed to slip my gag and start screaming. There was a traveler on the road. They panicked and left me in that sack instead. And you ended up on my land by coincidence. Mason's voice was heavy with skepticism. No, Eleanor admitted. I heard them say your name. They knew who owned this ranch. I think they left me here deliberately, a message perhaps, or bait. The implications settled over Mason like a shroud. They knew where he was, had known perhaps for some time, and now they had delivered this woman to his doorstep, a connection to his past, to Elizabeth, to the life he'd left behind. You should have stayed out of it, he said quietly. Some fights can't be won. Eleanor's eyes flashed. Is that what you tell yourself to sleep at night, Marshall? That it was unwinnable, that running away was your only choice? I buried my wife because of that fight, Mason snapped. I watched good men die. So yes, I walked away, and I'd do it again. Would Elizabeth be proud of that choice? The question hung in the air between them, sharp as a blade. Before Mason could respond, a sound from outside caught his attention, hoofbeats approaching fast. He moved to the window, staying to the side as he peered out. A single rider was coming up the road to his ranch, moving at an unhurried pace. Even at a distance, Mason recognized the set of his shoulders, the way he sat in the saddle. Stay here, he told Eleanor. Don't make a sound. He retrieved his peacemaker from the bedside table and moved to the front porch, positioning himself in the shadows just inside the doorway. The rider approached, stopping a respectful distance from the house. Hayes, the man called. It's Samuel Walters. We need to talk. Mason stepped onto the porch, keeping the revolver at his side but visible. Deputy Walters, he acknowledged. It's been a while. Samuel Walters had aged in the 5 years since Mason had seen him last. His once dark hair was now shot through with gray, and new lines creased the corners of his eyes. He wore a deputy's badge on his vest, pinned just above his gun belt. Heard there was trouble out of this way last night, Samuel said, his eyes taking in the bloodstains, still visible on the porch boards. 2 drifters causing problems. Something like that, Mason replied. One of them won't be causing any more trouble. Samuel nodded slowly. Sheriff sent me to investigate, said there'd been gunfire reported. Since when does the sheriff care about what happens this far out? Since it happens in Mason Hayes' property. Samuel dismounted, tying his horse to the hitching post. Can I come in? It's been a long ride. Mason hesitated. Samuel had been one of his deputies in the marshals, one of the few who'd survived the raid on RKD's camp. They'd never been close, but they'd been colleagues. Still, 5 years was a long time, and Mason trusted no one these days. We can talk out here, he said, gesturing to the porch chairs. Samuel's mouth tightened, but he nodded. Still the cautious one, I see. They sat, the familiar creaking of the porch boards, the only sound for a long moment. Samuel removed his hat, running a hand through his hair. I know why they came, Hayes, he said finally, and I know who sent them. Mason kept his expression neutral. Do tell. RKD is back in business. Bigger than before. They've got operations running from here to the border. All under different names, but it's Dawson pulling the strings. Word is he's never forgotten what you did to his organization. I did nothing to his organization, Mason replied bitterly. We failed, remember he won. Samuel leaned forward. Did he? His brother died in that raid. 3 of his top men too. He had to rebuild from scratch, go underground for years. That's not nothing. Mason studied his former colleague's face, searching for deception. Why are you here, Samuel, really? To warn you, Samuel said, his voice dropping. There's talk in town. Strangers asking questions about this ranch, about you, and last night 2 men rode through on their way south looking like they'd seen ghosts. Only one ghost out here, Mason replied, and he'd prefer to stay that way. Samuel's eyes drifted to the bloodstains on the porch. Doesn't look like you'll get that choice anymore. He hesitated, then added, there's something else. A woman went missing from Tucson 3 weeks back. Reporter for the Star. Been asking questions about missing persons, land deals gone wrong. The kind of questions that get people noticed. Mason kept his face impassive, but his grip tightened on the peacemaker. What's that got to do with me? Maybe nothing, Samuel conceded, but her last known article was about land seizures along the proposed railroad route. Same route that runs right through what used to be RKD territory. He paused. Same route that runs not 5 miles from this ranch. The implication was clear. Eleanor Reed hadn't stumbled onto RKD by accident. She'd been investigating something bigger. Something that connected to Mason's land, to the railroad, to powers beyond just Raymond Dawson. I appreciate the warning, Mason said, standing to signal the end of the conversation. But like I said, I'm just a rancher these days. I leave the law to men like you. Samuel rose slowly, settling his hat back on his head. That's just it, Hayes. The law isn't what it used to be around here. Not since Judge Prescott took over the circuit court. Man's got his fingers in everything, land deeds, business licenses, judicial appointments. Even the sheriff jumps when Prescott calls. Mason stiffened at the name. Calvin Prescott had been the presiding judge during the investigation into RKD 5 years ago. He'd been the one to deny Mason's request for additional men for more time to prepare. The one who'd later ruled that the failed raid had been due to Mason's poor leadership, not lack of resources. Judge Prescott is still around then, Mason said, keeping his voice neutral. More powerful than ever, Samuel confirmed. Word is he's looking to run for territorial governor next year. He fixed Mason with a pointed look. You understand what I'm saying if RKD is operating again and if Prescott is still in power. He left the sentence unfinished, but Mason understood. The corruption went higher than just a gang of outlaws. It reached into the very institutions meant to uphold justice. I understand, Mason said, and I'll keep my head down like always. Samuel studied him for a long moment, then nodded. See that you do. He turned to leave, but paused at the steps. One more thing, that reporter Eleanor Reed. If you hear anything about her, I'd appreciate knowing. Her sister was a friend of your wife's, I believe. The casual mention of the connection sent a chill through Mason. How much did Samuel know? Was this a genuine concern or a test? I'll keep my ears open, Mason replied noncommittally. Samuel mounted his horse, gathering the reins. Do that, and Hayes, watch your back. Not everyone who remembers you wishes you well. With that cryptic warning, he turned his horse and rode away, dust rising behind him in the morning light. Mason watched until he disappeared over the ridge, then quickly went back and locking the door behind him. Eleanor was sitting up in bed, her face pale but determined. He knows I'm here, she said immediately. He was testing you. Maybe, Mason conceded, or maybe he was genuinely warning me. Samuel and I worked together for years. And you trust him? Eleanor's voice was sharp with disbelief. Mason thought of the raid 5 years ago, how everything had gone wrong so quickly, how RKD had seemed prepared for them, almost waiting. Someone had betrayed them that day. Someone close. I trust no one, he said finally, especially not now. Eleanor nodded, satisfied. Good, because neither do I. She struggled to swing her legs over the side of the bed. We need to leave. It's not safe here. Mason moved to stop her. You're in no condition to travel. I'll manage, she insisted, though her face had gone even paler with the effort of sitting up. I have to get to Tucson. I have evidence, there are documents that prove the connection between RKD, Judge Prescott, and the railroad land grabs. Evidence that it could explain why they killed your wife. Mason went still. What did you say? Eleanor met his gaze directly. Elizabeth wasn't collateral damage, Mason. She was targeted. She knew something about patients she treated at the hospital. Something that connected to Prescott and RKD. That's impossible, Mason said, but doubt crept into his voice. Elizabeth was a nurse. She treated injuries, delivered babies. She wasn't involved in anything dangerous. Wasn't she? Eleanor challenged. She worked at Prescott Hospital. The same hospital where my sister worked. The same hospital that treated several young women who'd fallen downstairs or had accidents, but who later disappeared. The same hospital where records went missing after certain patients were discharged. Mason's mind raced. Elizabeth had mentioned concerns about patients once or twice, women who'd come in with suspicious injuries, who'd seemed afraid. But she'd never connected it to anything larger, had she? How do you know all this? He demanded. Margaret's letters, Eleanor replied. She wrote to me regularly until she disappeared. She mentioned Elizabeth several times, said they were becoming friends, that Elizabeth shared her concerns about certain patients. The last letter I received, just before she vanished, said they were going to compile evidence, maybe speak to a marshal about their suspicions. The implications crashed over Mason like a wave. Had Elizabeth been investigating RKD independently? Had she and Margaret Reed uncovered something that made them targets? If what you're saying is true, Mason said slowly, why didn't Elizabeth tell me I was a U.S. Marshal, for God's sake? Her husband. Eleanor's expression softened slightly. Perhaps she was protecting you. Or perhaps she wasn't sure yet, just had suspicions. The last letter from Margaret said they were still gathering evidence. Mason turned away, moving to the window. Outside, the Arizona landscape stretched golden in the afternoon light, peaceful and indifferent to the turmoil within him. For 5 years, he'd believed Elizabeth's death was his fault, the consequence of his failure as a leader, his inability to protect his team during the raid. The weight of that guilt had crushed him, driven him to resignation, to isolation, to this lonely ranch where he could harm no one else. But if Eleanor was right, if Elizabeth had been specifically targeted because of what she knew, then her death wasn't just a tragedy. It was murder, deliberate, planned, and someone would have to answer for it. These documents you mentioned, he said, turning back to Eleanor, what exactly do they prove? That Judge Prescott has been orchestrating land seizures along the proposed railroad route 4 years, Eleanor replied. That he uses legal mechanisms, foreclosures, eminent domain claims, questionable mineral rights to force people off their land. And when legal means fail, he sends RKD, Mason finished grimly. Exactly. The gang creates problems, cattle disappear, wells get poisoned, barns burned down. Eventually people sell for pennies on the dollar just to escape. And who buys the land shell companies, all leading back to the Arizona Central Railroad Development Corporation, of which Prescott is a major shareholder. It was an old story in the West, powerful men using violence and corruption to acquire land, resources, wealth. But to hear it connected so directly to Elizabeth's death made it personal in a way that set Mason's blood boiling. And you have proof of this, actual documents. Eleanor nodded. Land deeds, corporate records, witness testimonies. 5 years of investigation hidden in a lockbox at the Tucson Star. My editor doesn't even know it exists. I couldn't risk anyone finding it before I had the full picture. Mason considered this information. If true, it would be enough to bring down not just RKD, but Judge Prescott and whoever else was involved in their scheme. It would mean justice for Elizabeth, for Margaret Reed, for all the others who had suffered. But it would also mean stepping back into the world he'd left behind, a world of danger, violence, and betrayal. A world that had already taken everything he cared about. Even if I believed you, he said slowly, what do you expect me to do? I'm not a marshal anymore. I have no authority, no resources, no allies I can trust. You have me, Eleanor said simply, and you have the truth. Sometimes that's enough to start with. Mason looked at her, this woman who had endured torture rather than give up her quest for justice, who had pursued the truth about her sister's disappearance for years and at great personal risk, who now sat in his home injured but unbroken, offering him a chance he'd never thought to have again, a chance at redemption, a chance at justice for Elizabeth. RKD will be looking for you, he said, and now they know you're connected to me. We'd be walking into danger with every step. I'm already in danger, Eleanor replied. Have been since the day I started investigating them. The question is, are you willing to face yours? The question hung in the air between them, a challenge Mason had been avoiding for 5 years. He turned back to the window, his gaze falling on the small vegetable garden Elizabeth had started in their brief time together on this ranch. She'd had such plans for it, for their life here together. Plans that had died with her on that blood-soaked day 5 years ago. Mason had been a different man, then younger, more idealistic, convinced that justice would prevail if only he served it faithfully. That man had died alongside Elizabeth, replaced by a hollow shell, who wrote letters to ghosts and hid from the world. But perhaps Mason thought it was time for resurrection. I'll need a day, he said finally, to make arrangements. The man I captured last night is still in my barn. He might have information we can use. And I need to prepare the ranch for my absence. Eleanor nodded, relief evident in her expression. Thank you, she said quietly. Mason turned back to her, his face hardening. Don't thank me yet, Miss Reed. I haven't agreed to help you expose Prescott or take down RKD. I'm only agreeing to get you safely to Tucson to retrieve your evidence. What happens after that will depend on what we find. Fair enough, Eleanor conceded, but I think you'll find the evidence compelling. Mason moved to the door, pausing with his hand on the knob. One more thing. If we're going to do this, I need to know everything. No more secrets, no holding back information. We trust each other completely, or not at all. Eleanor held his gaze steadily. Agreed, no more secrets. As Mason stepped outside into the afternoon heat, he couldn't shake the feeling that he'd just made a deal that would either lead to justice or to his death. Perhaps both. Either way, there would be no going back now. The man in the barn regained consciousness shortly after sunset, waking to find himself bound to a support beam, Mason sitting on a hay bale before him, Peacemaker resting casually on his knee. Evening, Mason said quietly. Thought you might sleep through our entire conversation. The man blinked, confusion giving way to fear as he registered his situation. He was young, mid-20s at most, with the hard, lean look of someone who'd lived rough. His clothes were travel-stained but of good quality, and his boots were expensive. Not your typical drifter. Who are you? The man croaked, his throat dry from hours of unconsciousness. I was about to ask you the same thing, Mason replied, along with why you and your friend thought shooting up my home was a good idea. The man's eyes darted around the barn, searching for his companion. Where's Davis? Your friend feeding the coyotes by now, I expect. Mason's voice was matter-of-fact. He wasn't as lucky as you. Fear flashed across the young man's face. You killed him. He tried to kill me first, Mason pointed out. Seems fair. The man swallowed hard. Look, mister, this was just a job, nothing personal. We were paid to rough you up, a little scare you. Nobody said anything about dying. Paid by whom? The man hesitated, clearly weighing his options. Mason sighed and stood moving closer. Let me make this simple for you, son. You're in a bad situation. Your friend is dead. You're miles from anywhere on property owned by a man who, as you've seen, isn't afraid to defend himself. No one knows you're here except the people who sent you, and they clearly don't value your life very highly. He crouched down, meeting the man at eye level. Your only chance of walking out of here alive is to tell me everything. Who sent you, why, and what they want from me. The man's resistance crumbled visibly. A man in Tucson hired us. Big fellow, scar across his jaw. Didn't give his name, but he had money. Said there was a rancher out this way who needed to be reminded of old debts. What else did he say? What exactly were you supposed to do? Just scare you, the man insisted. Fire some shots, break some windows. Said to tell you RKD sends his regards, And that old business isn't forgotten. That's all I swear. Mason studied the man's face, searching for deception. Finding none, he asked, "This man with the scar, did he mention anything else, a woman perhaps, or a judge?" The man frowned. "No woman, but he did say something about making sure I was back in Tucson by the 15th because the judge wouldn't wait. Didn't know what he meant by that. The 15th, just 4 days away. Something was happening then. Something involving Judge Prescott." Mason filed the information away for later. "One more question," he said. "The tattoo on your friend's wrist, RKD. Do you have one too?" The man shook his head quickly. "No, sir. Davis got that before I knew him. Said it was from his time with some gang years back. I'm just a hired gun. I go where the money is." Mason considered the man before him. He seemed to be telling the truth, just a mercenary, not a true believer in whatever cause RKD and Prescott were pursuing. Still, he couldn't simply let him go. "Here's what's going to happen," Mason said, standing. "I'm going to untie you, give you some food and water, and a head start. You're going to ride south, cross the border, and keep going. If I ever see your face again in any context, I will kill you without hesitation. Do you understand?" The man nodded vigorously. "Yes, sir. You'll never see me again, I promise." Mason cut his bonds, keeping the peacemaker trained on him as he slowly got to his feet, rubbing circulation back into his wrists. "One last thing," Mason added as he handed the man a canteen. "If anyone asks you, tell them Mason Hayes died in that shootout. Tell them you buried him yourself. Can you do that?" The man nodded again, gulping water from the canteen. "Yes, sir. As far as I'm concerned, you're already dead." "Good," Mason said. "Now get out of my sight." He watched as the man mounted his horse and rode away, disappearing into the gathering darkness. It was a risk letting him go, but Mason needed someone to carry the message back, to make Dawson and Prescott believe, at least temporarily, that their problem had been eliminated. It would buy them time. Not much, but perhaps enough. When he returned to the house, Eleanor was awake, sitting at his kitchen table with a cup of tea before her. She'd found one of his shirts to wear the sleeves rolled up multiple times to accommodate her smaller frame. The bruises on her face stood out starkly against her pale skin, but her eyes were clear and alert. "Did he talk?" she asked as Mason entered. "Enough," Mason replied, pouring himself a cup of coffee from the pot on the stove. "He confirmed RKD is active again, working on something with Judge Prescott. Something happening on the 15th. Eleanor frowned. "The 15th, that's when the Territorial Land Commission meets in Tucson. They're voting on final approval for the railroad route, which would make Prescott's land acquisitions official and irreversible." Mason added, the pieces falling into place. "If your evidence could stop that vote." "It would ruin him," Eleanor finished. "Everything he's worked for, all the lives he's destroyed, it would all be for nothing." Mason sat across from her, cradling his coffee cup in weathered hands. "Then we need to get to Tucson before the 15th. But we can't take the main roads. They'll be watching for you, and now for me too." "There's an old Apache trail through the mountains," Eleanor suggested. "It adds a day to the journey, but it's rarely used these days. I took it once while investigating a story about reservation conditions." Mason nodded. "It's a good plan. We'll leave at first light tomorrow." Eleanor studied him over the rim of her teacup. "You've changed your mind, haven't you? About helping me expose Prescott in RKD." Mason met her gaze steadily. "Let's just say I'm open to the possibility that your evidence might be worth the risk." A small smile curved Eleanor's lips. "That's a start." They sat in companionable silence for a moment, the only sound the ticking of the old clock on Mason's mantel. Outside, coyotes called to each other across the valley, their cries echoing in the vast Arizona night. "Can I ask you something?" Eleanor said finally, her voice softer than before. Mason nodded, wary but willing. "The letters, the ones you write to Elizabeth, do they help? Do you feel her presence when you write them?" The question caught Mason off guard. He'd expected interrogation about the case, about his past as a marshal, about the failed raid. Not this personal inquiry that cut straight to his heart. "Sometimes," he admitted, surprising himself with his honesty, "sometimes it feels like she's reading over my shoulder, listening to my thoughts. Other times it's just words on paper disappearing into nothing." He paused, then added, "But I keep writing anyway." "Because it's all you have left of her," Eleanor said softly. It wasn't a question. "Yes." Mason took a long sip of his coffee, using the moment to gather his composure. "What about you? How long have you been searching for your sister?" "Since the day she disappeared," Eleanor replied. "At first I thought the marshals would find her, that justice would prevail." Her voice held no accusation, just a sad acknowledgement of reality. "When that didn't happen, I started investigating myself. Used my position at the newspaper to ask questions, follow leads. It became everything." "At the expense of your own life," Mason observed. Eleanor shrugged. "Margaret was all the family I had left. Our parents died when we were young. She raised me, sacrificed everything to put me through nursing school. I couldn't just abandon her." The parallel to his own situation with Elizabeth wasn't lost on Mason. He, too, had abandoned his life, his career, his purpose, but not in pursuit of justice. In flight from it. We should get some rest, he said, standing abruptly. Tomorrow will be a long day. Eleanor nodded but made no move to rise. One more question, if I may. Mason paused, waiting. If we find proof, definitive proof, that Judge Prescott and RKD were responsible for Elizabeth's death, what will you do? Seek justice through the law, or take it into your own hands? It was a question Mason had asked himself many times over the years, in the dark hours when sleep eluded him and memories crowded close. I don't know, he answered honestly. 5 years ago, I would have said justice must come through the law, or it isn't justice at all. Now, he shook his head. Now I'm not so sure. Eleanor held his gaze steadily. For what it's worth, I believe the law is still the right path. Not because men like Prescott deserve its protections, but because we deserve to be better than them. The words echoed something Elizabeth might have said, and for a moment Mason could almost hear his wife's voice overlapping with Eleanor's. Get some sleep, Miss Reed, he said finally. We leave at dawn. As he walked to his bedroom, Mason paused in the hallway, looking back at Eleanor sitting at his kitchen table. In the dim lamplight, with her head bowed and shoulders slumped with exhaustion, she reminded him of Elizabeth on that last morning, determined, resolute, carrying a burden too heavy for one person alone. He'd failed Elizabeth. He wouldn't fail again. Entering his bedroom, Mason knelt beside the bed and pulled out the wooden box containing his marshal's badge. Beneath it lay a leather-bound journal, Elizabeth's diary, one of the few possessions he'd recovered after her death. He'd never been able to bring himself to read it, to invade her private thoughts. But now, with Eleanor's revelations about Elizabeth's possible investigation, the diary took on new significance. Mason opened it with trembling hands, turning past the early entries about their life together, their hopes for the future, their plans for the ranch. He stopped when he reached an entry dated just 2 weeks before her death, April 2nd, 1880. Another young woman brought in today with suspicious injuries. Third this month. Like the others, her story doesn't match her wounds. M agrees something is very wrong. We've started keeping our own records separate from the official files. Judge P visited the ward today, speaking with Dr. Collins at length. Something about his manner disturbs me, the way he looked at the girl as if assessing property rather than a patient. I should tell Mason, but he's so consumed with his work these days. Perhaps when this RKD business is settled, we can look into it together. Mason read the entry twice, his heart pounding. Elizabeth had known. She'd been investigating, just as Eleanor claimed. And she'd noticed Judge Prescott's involvement, his strange interest in the injured women. He turned the page, but the next entry was mundane notes about garden plants, a recipe she wanted to try. Nothing more about the suspicious patients or Judge Prescott. Mason closed the diary, his mind racing. Elizabeth had been keeping records separate from the hospital's official files. Where would she have hidden them? And if she had uncovered a connection between Judge Prescott and RKD, could that have been the real reason for the raid going so disastrously wrong? For 5 years, Mason had believed the raid failed due to bad intelligence, poor planning, or simple bad luck. He'd shouldered the blame, carrying it like a stone in his chest. But now a new possibility emerged, one that cast the entire tragedy in a different light. What if the raid had been designed to fail from the start? What if someone within his own team had ensured it would go wrong? And if so, who had betrayed them? Who had betrayed Elizabeth? Mason returned the diary to its hiding place, his decision made. He would accompany Eleanor to Tucson, help her retrieve her evidence. And then together they would uncover the truth about what had happened 5 years ago, the truth about Elizabeth's death, whatever the cost. As dawn broke over the Arizona desert, Mason Hayes and Eleanor Reed rode out from the ranch, leaving behind the solitary life he had built and heading toward a confrontation 5 years in the making. Justice, like vengeance, was a patient hunter, and its time had finally come. The old Apache Trail wound through the mountains like a serpent, narrow and treacherous. Sheer cliffs rose on one side, fell away on the other. A misstep could mean death, but the path offered what Mason and Eleanor needed most: invisibility. They'd been riding since dawn, speaking little, each lost in private thoughts. The morning sun cast long shadows across the rocky terrain, painting the landscape in shades of gold and amber. Despite the beauty, Mason remained vigilant, eyes constantly scanning their surroundings for signs of pursuit. Eleanor rode behind him, her posture stiff with pain, but unyielding. She hadn't complained once, though Mason knew her injuries must be agonizing. There was a strength in her that reminded him of Elizabeth, a quiet determination that refused to bend, even when breaking might be easier. We'll rest up ahead, Mason said, breaking the silence. There's a spring in that grove of cottonwoods. Eleanor nodded, relief briefly crossing her face before she masked it. How much farther to Tucson? At this pace, 2 days, maybe 3. Mason glanced back at her. Think you can make it? I'll make it, she replied simply. They dismounted by the spring, letting the horses drink while Mason refilled their canteens. Eleanor eased herself onto a sun-warmed rock, wincing as she stretched her legs. Let me check those bandages, Mason said, approaching with his small medical kit. Eleanor hesitated, then nodded, rolling up her sleeve to reveal the wire cuts on her wrist. Mason knelt beside her, gently unwrapping the soiled bandage. The wounds were angry and red, but showed no signs of infection, a small mercy in a situation with few. You have a healer's hands, Eleanor observed as he cleaned the cuts with water from the spring. Elizabeth taught you well. Mason's movements faltered briefly at the mention of his wife's name. She tried, said I was her worst student. A ghost of a smile touched Eleanor's lips. Margaret said the same about me. I could diagnose pneumonia from across a room, but couldn't wrap a bandage properly to save my life. Your sister, Mason said carefully, applying a fresh bandage. Tell me about her. Eleanor's expression softened, pain of a different sort flickering in her eyes. Margaret was radiant. That's the only word for it. She lit up rooms just by entering them. Had this laugh that made everyone around her laugh too, even if they didn't know the joke. She paused, lost in memory. She was the smart one, the brave one, always standing up for people who couldn't stand up for themselves. That's why she became a nurse. Eleanor nodded. That and she was good at it. Had a way of making people feel safe, even when they were scared or hurting. She looked down at her newly bandaged wrist. She would have liked you, I think. Mason tied off the bandage and sat back on his heels. Why do you say that? Because you're still trying to do the right thing even when it costs you. Eleanor met his gaze directly. Even when you're afraid. The observation struck too close to home, piercing the armor Mason had built around himself these past 5 years. He stood abruptly, turning away to pack up the medical supplies. We should keep moving, he said, his voice gruff. There's a place to camp about 10 miles ahead. We can stop there for the night. Eleanor watched him retreat, understanding in her eyes. Of course. They rode in silence for the rest of the afternoon, the trail gradually descending from the mountains into rolling foothills. By the time dusk fell, they'd reached a small clearing beside a dry creek bed, a natural campsite sheltered by rock formations on 3 sides. Mason helped Eleanor dismount, then set about making camp with the efficiency of a man accustomed to traveling alone. He gathered wood for a small fire, laid out their bedrolls, and prepared a simple meal of jerky, beans, and coffee. As they sat beside the fire, the desert night closed in around them, vast and star-filled. The silence between them had shifted from awkward to companionable, the shared journey creating a tentative bond. May I ask you something? Eleanor said, cradling her coffee cup in both hands for warmth. Mason nodded, bracing himself for another probing question about Elizabeth or his past. The letters you write, she began, surprising him. Do you ever write about the future or only the past? Mason considered the question. In 5 years of letters to Elizabeth, he'd chronicled his daily life, his memories, his regrets. But the future, that had seemed a luxury he no longer deserved. Mostly the past, he admitted. The future stopped the day she died. Eleanor's gaze remained on the fire, its light casting shadows across her bruised face. I understand that. After Margaret disappeared, I couldn't see beyond finding her. Everything else, my career, relationships, normal life, it all seemed trivial in comparison. She looked up, meeting his eyes across the flames. But I've been thinking lately, what happens if I do find her? Or if I learn definitively that she's gone? What then? Who am I when this search is over? The questions resonated with Mason in ways he hadn't expected. Who was he beyond his grief, beyond his guilt? He'd been a marshal once, a husband, a man with purpose. Now he was, what, a shadow, a ghost haunting his own life. I don't know, he said honestly. I've never let myself think that far ahead. Eleanor nodded, understanding in her eyes. Maybe we should. Think ahead, I mean. Not just about Tucson and the evidence, but about after. About who we want to be when this is finished. Mason stared into the fire, watching the flames dance and flicker. The idea of a future beyond vengeance, beyond justice for Elizabeth, it seemed almost blasphemous. And yet a small part of him recognized the wisdom in Eleanor's words. Get some sleep, he said, finally unable to engage with the possibility she offered. I'll take first watch. Eleanor studied him for a moment longer, then nodded, retreating to her bedroll. Soon her breathing deepened into the rhythm of sleep, leaving Mason alone with the night and his thoughts. He moved away from the fire, positioning himself on a rocky outcropping that offered a view of the trail behind them. The desert stretched vast and silent in the moonlight, seemingly empty of life. But Mason knew better. The desert was never truly empty. Creatures moved in the darkness, hunting, surviving. And perhaps somewhere out there, men followed their trail. As he kept watch, Mason's mind returned to Eleanor's question about the future. For 5 years, he'd existed rather than lived, each day a monotonous replica of the one before. The ranch had been not a home, but a hiding place, a self-imposed prison where he could atone for his failures. But now, thrust back into the world by Eleanor's arrival, he found himself remembering what it felt like to have purpose, to fight for something beyond mere survival. Was that a betrayal of Elizabeth's memory, or might it be in some way honoring it? Mason pulled out the small leather notebook he always carried, his letter book for Elizabeth. By the light of the moon, he began to write, his pencil scratching softly against the paper. Lizzie, I'm on the trail again, though not as a marshal this time, just a man seeking truth. Eleanor Reed found me, Margaret's sister. She believes your death wasn't random, that you were targeted because of something you knew. I found your diary, read your entry about the suspicious patients about Judge Prescott. Were you investigating him, Lizzie? Were you in danger because of it? I should have protected you better. Should have listened more closely when you spoke of your concerns. Eleanor asked me about the future, what comes after justice is served. I don't know how to answer her. For 5 years, there has been no future, only an endless present stretching into nothing. But now I find myself wondering, would you want this half-life for me? This existence without purpose or connection? I miss you every day. That will never change. But perhaps there is a way to honor your memory that doesn't require me to join you just yet. Forever yours. Mason, he closed the notebook, returning it to his pocket. The act of writing had clarified something within him, a realization that seeking justice for Elizabeth didn't mean he had to remain forever entombed in grief. It was a small revelation, fragile as a desert flower. But it was something. A beginning, perhaps. The night passed without incident, and dawn found them back on the trail, pushing deeper into the foothills. By mid-morning, they'd reached a vantage point that offered a sweeping view of the valley below, and in the distance, the sprawl of Tucson. "We're closer than I thought," Eleanor said, relief evident in her voice. "If we push hard, we could reach the city by nightfall." Mason studied the landscape with a practiced eye. The closer they got to Tucson, the greater the danger. RKD would have men watching the usual approaches to the city looking for Eleanor. For him, too, if they'd discovered he still lived. "We'll skirt around to the north," he decided. "Come in through the Mexican Quarter after dark. Less chance of being spotted that way." Eleanor nodded, trusting his judgment. They continued their journey, the terrain gradually flattening as they descended into the valley. The heat intensified, the sun beating down mercilessly from a cloudless sky. By late afternoon, they'd reached the outskirts of Tucson. Mason led them through a maze of arroyos and dry creek beds, avoiding the main roads. As dusk fell, they approached the city from the north as planned, entering through a poor district where strangers were common and questions rare. They stabled their horses at a small livery run by an old Mexican man who asked no questions when Mason pressed extra coins into his palm. From there, they proceeded on foot, keeping to the shadows of narrow streets and alleyways. "Where are these documents of yours?" Mason asked in a low voice as they walked. "The newspaper office," Eleanor replied. "In a false bottom of my desk drawer. The night clerk knows me, he'll let us in." Mason nodded, though unease prickled at the back of his neck. Too many variables, too many potential witnesses. But they had no choice. The Tucson Star occupied a modest two-story building on a side street off the main plaza. Light glowed from a single window on the ground floor of the editor's office where the night clerk would be working. "Wait here," Eleanor said, moving toward the front entrance. Mason caught her arm. "We go together." She started to protest, then reconsidered. "Fine, but let me do the talking. Jim knows me, but he'll be suspicious of strangers." They approached the door, Eleanor slightly ahead. She knocked a distinctive pattern that suggested a regular signal between her and the clerk. After a moment, the door opened a crack, revealing a young man with ink-stained fingers and spectacles perched on his nose. His eyes widened at the sight of Eleanor's bruised face. "Miss Reed, my God, what happened to you? Everyone's been worried sick." "It's a long story, Jim," Eleanor said with a tired smile. "May we come in? I need to retrieve something from my desk." Jim's gaze shifted to Mason, wariness replacing concern. "Who's your friend?" "This is Mason," Eleanor replied. "He's helping me with the story. You can trust him." Jim hesitated, then stepped back, opening the door wider. "The editor's been beside himself, Miss Reed. Said if you didn't turn up by the end of the week, he'd have to notify your next of kin." "Well, as you can see, I'm very much alive," Eleanor said, stepping into the familiar office space. "Though I'd appreciate if you didn't mention my visit to anyone just yet. The story I'm working on, it's sensitive." Jim nodded eagerly. "Of course, Miss Reed, my lips are sealed." Mason followed them inside, positioning himself near the window where he could watch the street. The newspaper office was cluttered but organized, desks arranged in rows, typewriters covered for the night, the lingering smell of ink and paper permeating the air. Eleanor moved to a desk in the corner, her workspace evidently, and opened the bottom drawer. Mason watched as she felt underneath the drawer itself, her fingers finding a hidden catch. With a soft click, a false bottom sprung loose, revealing a manila envelope tucked inside. "Got it," she said, relief washing over her face as she withdrew the envelope. "What exactly is that?" Jim asked, curiosity overcoming his discretion. "Evidence," Eleanor replied simply, "the kind that could get people killed." Jim's eyes widened behind his spectacles. "The RKD story. You found something concrete." Mason tensed at the mention of RKD. How many people knew about Eleanor's investigation? "Something like that," Eleanor said, deliberately vague. "Thank you for letting us in, Jim. Remember, not a word to anyone." "Of course, Miss Reed, but where will you go now? Should I tell the editor? You're safe, at least." Eleanor hesitated, glancing at Mason. "No one can know she's back in Tucson," Mason said firmly. "Not yet. It's not safe." Jim's gaze shifted between them, uncertainty clear on his young face. "Are you in some kind of trouble, Miss Reed?" "The less you know, the safer you are," Eleanor told him kindly. "Just give me 3 more days. After that, you can tell Mr. Hollister everything." Jim nodded reluctantly. 3 days, but if you're not back by then, I'm telling him everything I know." "Fair enough," Eleanor agreed. She tucked the envelope inside her jacket. "Now we should—" The sound of approaching horses cut her off. Mason moved swiftly to the window, peering through the curtains. 3 riders had stopped outside, dismounting with purpose. "We've got company," he said grimly. "Back door." "Through the printing room," Jim said, pointing to a door at the rear of the office. "It leads to the alley behind the building." Mason nodded. "Go," he told Eleanor. "I'll be right behind you." Eleanor hesitated. "Mason, go," he repeated more forcefully. "The evidence is what matters. Get it somewhere safe." She held his gaze for a moment longer, then nodded, understanding the stakes. With the envelope clutched to her chest, she hurried toward the back door, Jim leading the way. Mason stayed by the window, watching as the 3 men approached the front entrance. They wore ordinary clothes but moved with the coordinated precision of men accustomed to violence. One of them, a tall figure with a distinctive scar across his jaw, looked familiar, though Mason couldn't place him immediately. A sharp knock sounded on the front door. "Mr. Hollister," a deep voice called. "Sorry to disturb you so late, but we need to speak with you about one of your reporters." Mason backed away from the window, moving silently toward the rear of the office. He paused at Eleanor's desk, noticing a framed photograph she'd left behind, a picture of 2 women in nurses' uniforms, arms around each other's shoulders. Eleanor and Margaret, he guessed, sisters in life separated by violence. Another knock, louder this time. "Mr. Hollister, it's Deputy Walters from the sheriff's office. Please open up." Mason froze at the name. Samuel Walters, his former colleague, now apparently in pursuit. But why would Samuel be looking for Eleanor at this hour with no official warrant or announcement? And who were the men with him? The pieces clicked into place with sudden clarity. The man with the scarred jaw, he'd been at the RKD camp 5 years ago, one of Dawson's lieutenants. Mason had glimpsed him during the raid, escaping on horseback while gunfire erupted around them. Samuel wasn't just accompanying these men. He was working with them. The realization hit Mason like a physical blow. Samuel Walters, his fellow marshal, his colleague for years, had betrayed them. Had perhaps betrayed Elizabeth. The pounding on the door intensified. "We know someone's in there. Open up or we'll break it down." Mason slipped through the door into the printing room, finding himself in a large space dominated by a massive printing press. The smell of ink was stronger here, almost overwhelming. At the far end, a door stood ajar, revealing a glimpse of the alley beyond. He moved quickly through the room, emerging into the alley, just as the sound of splintering wood echoed from the front of the building. They'd broken down the door. Eleanor and Jim were waiting in the shadows, tension evident in their postures. "Who are they?" Eleanor whispered as Mason joined them. "Samuel Walters," Mason replied grimly, "and at least 1 RKD man. We need to move. Now." Jim's face paled. "The deputy sheriff is working with RKD, but that's corruption runs deep." Mason cut him off. "Which way to the nearest safe house?" Eleanor pointed down the alley. 3 blocks east, then north on Convent Street. "My friend Maria runs a boarding house. She'll hide us." "Go," Mason said. "I'll create a diversion. Meet you there." Eleanor shook her head firmly. "We stay together. I'm not leaving you to face them alone." Before Mason could argue, shouts erupted from inside the building. They'd found the back door. "No time to argue," Jim said urgently. "Follow me. I know a shortcut." He led them down the alley at a run, turning sharply into an even narrower passage between buildings. They emerged onto a quiet street lined with small adobe houses, their windows dark in the late hour. "Maria's boarding house is there." Eleanor pointed to a 2-story building at the end of the street. "The blue door." They hurried toward it, keeping to the shadows. Behind them, more shouts echoed as their pursuers spilled into the alley. Jim stopped suddenly. "I'll lead them away," he said, determination in his young face. "Buy you some time." "Jim, no," Eleanor began. "They don't know what I look like," he insisted. "I'll run the other way, make some noise. They'll think it's you." Before either of them could protest further, Jim darted across the street, deliberately making himself visible in a patch of moonlight before running in the opposite direction. As predicted, shouts followed him immediately, and the sound of pursuing footsteps faded into the distance. "Brave kid," Mason muttered. "Too brave." Eleanor agreed, worry in her voice. "Come on before they realize they're chasing the wrong person." They reached the boarding house without further incident. Eleanor knocked softly on the blue door, a pattern similar to the one she'd used at the newspaper office. After a tense moment, the door opened a crack, revealing a middle-aged Mexican woman with silver-streaked black hair. "¿Quién es?" she demanded, then gasped as she recognized Eleanor. "Dios mío, Eleanor." "Maria," Eleanor said with evident relief. "We need help. A place to hide just for tonight." Maria's dark eyes took in Eleanor's bruised face, then shifted to Mason with open suspicion. But she nodded, opening the door wider. "Come in quickly," she said, her English accented but clear. "The back room is empty. No one will look for you there." They slipped inside Maria, locking the door behind them. The boarding house was simple but clean, smelling of chili peppers and fresh bread. Maria led them through a dimly lit hallway to a small room at the rear of the building. "Wait here," she instructed. "I will bring food water for washing." "Then you tell me who did this to your face, yes?" Eleanor managed a tired smile. "Thank you, Maria. We won't stay long, just until morning." When Maria had gone, Mason moved to the window, carefully checking the street outside. No sign of pursuit yet, but it wouldn't take long for Samuel and his men to realize they'd been tricked. We should be safe here for a few hours, Eleanor said, sinking onto the edge of the narrow bed. Maria won't betray us. Her son disappeared 3 years ago, one of the first cases I investigated that led me to RKD. Mason turned from the window. Let me see those documents. Eleanor nodded, removing the envelope from inside her jacket. Her hands trembled slightly as she opened it, spreading the contents across the bed. Land deeds, corporate records, handwritten witness testimonies, and detailed maps of the proposed railroad route with certain properties marked in red. These properties were all seized within the last 5 years, Eleanor explained, pointing to the red markings. Some through foreclosure, others through eminent domain claims. Some through more, violent means. Mason examined the documents with growing unease. The pattern was clear: a systematic acquisition of land along the railroad's path, all channeled through shell companies that ultimately led back to Arizona Central Railroad Development Corporation. And Prescott is connected to this corporation, he asked. Eleanor nodded, pulling out a stack of financial records. He's not just connected, he's the majority shareholder through various proxies and nominees. But if you follow the money, she traced a series of transactions with her finger. It all leads back to him. Mason studied the evidence, his marshal's training allowing him to see the bigger picture. This wasn't just corruption, it was an elaborate criminal enterprise using both legal mechanisms and outright violence to achieve its ends. This is enough to bring charges, he acknowledged, but proving it in court would be another matter. Prescott has the judiciary in his pocket. Not all of it, Eleanor countered. Judge Monroe in Phoenix is known for his integrity. If we could get these documents to him. Assuming we live that long, Mason said grimly. Samuel Walters knows we're in the city now. He'll have men watching every road out of Tucson by morning. Eleanor's face fell, the weight of their situation settling over her. Then what do we do? Before Mason could respond, a soft knock sounded at the door. Maria entered, carrying a tray with bread, cheese, and a pitcher of water. She set it down on a small table, then turned to Eleanor with concern in her dark eyes. You are in trouble. Yes, bad men are looking for you. Eleanor hesitated, then nodded. Yes, Maria, very bad men. It's better if you don't know more. Maria's expression hardened. These men, they take my Alejandro, they take your sister. I believe so, Eleanor admitted. I'm trying to prove it to bring them to justice. Maria nodded decisively. Then I help you. My cousin drives a wagon to Phoenix tomorrow at dawn. Deliveries for the hotels. He can hide you. Mason and Eleanor exchanged glances. It was risky, but perhaps their best chance of getting out of Tucson undetected. Thank you, Maria, Eleanor said softly. We would be grateful for your cousin's help. Maria nodded again. Rest now, I wake you before dawn. She moved to the door, then paused, looking back at them. Be careful, mi amiga. These men, they have no souls. After she left, Mason and Eleanor ate in silence, the weight of the day's events settling over them. The small room felt suddenly intimate, the single bed a reminder of their precarious situation. You take the bed, Mason said, moving to position himself in a chair by the window. I'll keep watch. Eleanor looked as if she might argue, then nodded, her exhaustion evident. Wake me in a few hours. You need rest too. Mason agreed, though he had no intention of sleeping. His mind was too full of the day's revelations. Samuel's betrayal, the evidence of Prescott's corruption, the growing certainty that Elizabeth's death had been no accident. As Eleanor settled onto the bed, Mason returned to the window, watching the quiet street below. The city slept, unaware of the corruption festering at its heart, the lives destroyed in the name of progress and profit. He thought of Samuel Walters, the man he'd once trusted with his life, who now hunted him through the streets of Tucson. Had Samuel been the one to betray them 5 years ago? Had he been the one to ensure the raid would fail? That Elizabeth would die? The questions burned in Mason's mind, demanding answers. But for now, survival took precedence. Get the evidence to Judge Monroe in Phoenix. Expose Prescott and RKD. Only then could he confront Samuel and learn the full truth about Elizabeth's death. Outside, a dog barked in the distance, then fell silent. The night deepened, stars fading as clouds moved in from the west. Mason remained at his post, vigilant, his hand never far from the peacemaker at his side. Hours passed. Eleanor slept fitfully, occasionally murmuring words Mason couldn't distinguish. He found himself watching her in the dim light, the determination that remained evident, even in sleep, the strength that had carried her through her ordeal. There was something about her that reminded him of Elizabeth, though the two women were different in many ways. Perhaps it was their shared commitment to justice, their refusal to look away from suffering. Or perhaps it was simply that both had awakened something in Mason that he'd thought long dead, a sense of purpose, of connection to something larger than himself. Around midnight, Eleanor stirred, sitting up with a soft gasp. Her eyes wide and disoriented, found Mason in the darkness. Just a dream, he said quietly. You're safe. She nodded, pushing hair from her face with a trembling hand. Not a dream, a memory. Mason didn't press for details. Some memories were better left unspoken, especially in the vulnerable hours of the night. Eleanor rose, moving to join him by the window. You should rest, she said. I can keep watch. I'm fine, Mason insisted. Again. Years of stakeouts trained by to go without sleep. Eleanor studied him in the dim light. You still blame yourself, don't you, for the failed raid, for Elizabeth? The observation so direct and unvarnished caught Mason off guard. It was my operation, he said finally, my responsibility. And if you were betrayed, if someone ensured it would fail, then it was still my responsibility, Mason replied. I chose the men, I trusted them. Eleanor was silent for a moment, considering his words. That's a heavy burden to carry alone. I've managed. Have you? Her gaze was penetrating, seeing too much. Living alone on that ranch, writing letters to ghosts, is that managing or just surviving? The question hit too close to home, echoing his own thoughts from earlier. Mason turned away, uncomfortable with her insight. We should both try to rest, he said, changing the subject. Dawn will be here soon enough. Eleanor recognized the deflection, but didn't push further. She returned to the bed, though she didn't lie down immediately. Mason, she said softly, whatever we find in Phoenix, whatever the truth turns out to be, I want you to know I'm grateful. For saving my life, for helping me get this far. The simple gratitude, offered without expectation, touched something in Mason that had been walled off for too long. He nodded, unable to form words around the sudden tightness in his throat. Eleanor seemed to understand. She lay down, pulling the thin blanket over herself. Good night, Mason. Good night, Miss Reed. As she drifted back to sleep, Mason returned to his vigil at the window. But his thoughts were no longer solely focused on the dangers outside. Instead, he found himself contemplating Eleanor's question about managing versus surviving. For 5 years, he'd existed in a kind of suspended animation, not living, merely persisting. The ranch had been less a home than a fortress, a place to hide from the world and from himself. But now, thrust back into that world by Eleanor's arrival, he found himself reluctantly awakening. Feeling things he'd thought long dead, anger, purpose, perhaps even hope. It was uncomfortable, like blood returning to a numbed limb, painful in its renewal. Was this what Elizabeth would have wanted for him? Not the vengeance he'd occasionally dreamed of, but this slow, painful return to life. He had no answer. But as dawn approached, bringing with it new dangers and the promise of answers long sought, Mason Hayes found himself considering, for the first time in 5 years, the possibility of a future beyond grief. True to her word, Maria woke them before dawn. Her cousin, a weathered man named Hector, waited with his wagon in the alley behind the boarding house. The vehicle was loaded with supplies for the Phoenix Hotel's linens, foodstuffs, locally made handicrafts, providing ample hiding places among the cargo. My cousin knows nothing, Maria warned as she led them to the wagon. Better this way. He thinks you are eloping, running from angry father. She smiled faintly at the fiction. Very romantic, yes. Mason and Eleanor exchanged awkward glances, but didn't correct her. The less Hector knew about their true situation, the safer he would be. They settled into a space Hector had created among the crates and barrels, cramped but serviceable. Blankets concealed them from casual observation, though any serious search would quickly reveal their presence. Gracias, Maria, Eleanor said, embracing the older woman. I won't forget this. Find the men who took my Alejandro, Maria replied fiercely. This is all the thanks I need. As the wagon rumbled out of Tucson in the pre-dawn darkness, Mason and Eleanor huddled in their hiding place, the documents secure in a waterproof pouch between them. The journey to Phoenix would take nearly 2 days. 2 days of hiding, of vulnerability, of hoping their pursuers would look elsewhere. The wagon joined the main road heading northwest, one of several vehicles leaving the city as dawn broke. Mason, peering through a small gap in the canvas covering, watched for signs of pursuit. So far, the road behind them remained clear. Do you think they'll check the wagons leaving town? Eleanor whispered, her voice barely audible above the creak of wheels and clop of hooves. Eventually, Mason replied, but they'll focus on the stagecoaches and private riders first. A delivery wagon is less suspicious. They fell silent as the wagon slowed, approaching what sounded like a checkpoint. Mason tensed, hand moving to his peacemaker. Morning, Hector, a voice called. Early start today. Si, Senor Walters. Hector replied, his tone carefully respectful. Many deliveries in Phoenix. Must leave early. Mason froze at the name. Samuel Walters, checking vehicles personally. The hunt was serious indeed. Carrying anything unusual today? Samuel asked casually. Or anyone, just the usual, senor. Linens, food, crafts for the hotels. Mind if I take a look? Of course not, senor. The wagon creaked as Samuel apparently climbed aboard. Footsteps moved across the wooden boards above them, pausing here and there to shift items. Mason and Eleanor remained perfectly still, barely breathing as the footsteps approached their hiding place. A crate near their heads was moved, then replaced. Another moment of tense silence followed. All seems in order, Samuel said finally. Safe travels, Hector. Gracias, deputy. The wagon lurched forward again, continuing on its journey. Mason and Eleanor remained frozen for several minutes until they were well away from the checkpoint. That was too close, Eleanor whispered finally. Mason nodded, though his mind was racing. Samuel had checked their hiding place, had moved a crate directly above them, yet hadn't revealed them. Why was it possible he truly hadn't seen them? Or was something else at play? The questions gnawed at him as the wagon continued its journey. The sun climbing higher in the sky, heat building beneath the canvas covering. By midday, the temperature had become almost unbearable in their confined space. Sweat soaked through their clothes and the air grew stale and difficult to breathe. Hector stopped occasionally to water his horses and take brief breaks, but he never spoke to his hidden passengers or acknowledged their presence. Whether from discretion or genuine ignorance, his silence was a blessing. As the day wore on, the road grew rougher, the wagon jolting over ruts and stones. Eleanor, still recovering from her injuries, struggled to find a comfortable position in the cramped space. Mason noticed her discomfort, but could offer little help beyond sharing his water canteen. "Tell me about the ranch," she said during one particularly monotonous stretch, her voice low to avoid being overheard by Hector. Mason glanced at her, surprised by the request. "Not much to tell. 100 acres, most of it scrubland, small herd of cattle, vegetable garden that never quite thrives." "But you chose it specifically," Eleanor pressed. "That location, that piece of land. Why?" Mason hesitated, unaccustomed to sharing personal details. But the long journey and shared danger had created a strange intimacy between them. "Elizabeth loved the view," he said finally. "The way the mountains catch the light at sunset. We passed through the area once years ago, and she said if we ever settled down, she'd want a place just like that." He paused, remembering. "After she died, it seemed like the only place I could go." Eleanor nodded, understanding in her eyes. "It's beautiful country, harsh but beautiful." "Like most worthwhile things," Mason agreed. They lapsed into silence again, each lost in private thoughts. The wagon continued northwest, the terrain gradually changing from desert to scattered woodland as they gained elevation. By nightfall, they had reached a small way station, little more than a stable, a well, and a simple adobe building where travelers could find basic meals and shelter. Hector parked his wagon in the stable area, and once he was sure no one was watching, helped Mason and Eleanor emerge from their hiding place. "You sleep in wagon tonight," he told them in broken English. "More safe. I bring food." And they thanked him, grateful for his continued assistance despite his limited understanding of their situation. True to his word, Hector returned later with a simple meal of beans, tortillas, and coffee, along with news from the way station. "Men on horseback passed through earlier," he reported, concern evident in his weathered face. "Ask questions about man and woman traveling together. Offer money for information." Mason and Eleanor exchanged worried glances. Their pursuers were casting a wide net, likely checking all routes between Tucson and Phoenix. "Did anyone at the station talk to them?" Mason asked. Hector shrugged. "Station keeper is friend to Maria. He say nothing. But others." He spread his hands in a gesture of uncertainty. "We should move on," Mason decided. "Tonight, under cover of darkness. It's too risky to wait until morning." Eleanor nodded in agreement. "How much farther to Phoenix?" "Maybe 30 miles, Hector estimated. But road is bad. Very rough at night." "We've handled worse," Mason assured him. "If you're willing to continue, we'd be grateful." Hector considered the request, then nodded. "For Maria, I'd do this, but you must hide better now. Men will be looking more carefully." They rearranged the wagon's contents, creating a more secure hiding place beneath false bottoms in 2 large crates. It was even more cramped than before, but offered better concealment should they be stopped and searched again. Under the cover of darkness, Hector's wagon slipped away from the way station, taking a less traveled route toward Phoenix. The road was indeed rough, every jolt and bump magnified in their confined space. But the alternative, waiting for Samuel and his men to find them, was far worse. They traveled through the night, stopping only briefly to rest the horses. Dawn found them still some distance from Phoenix, but in the foothills rather than the open desert where trees and rock formations offered better cover. Hector pulled the wagon into a secluded grove beside a small stream well off the main road. "Rest here," he advised. "Too dangerous to enter Phoenix in daylight. Wait until dark." Mason agreed with the assessment. They emerged from their hiding places, stiff and sore from the long confinement. Eleanor winced as she stretched, her injuries clearly paining her despite her attempts to hide it. "Let me check those bandages," Mason said, noticing a fresh blood stain on her sleeve where the wire cuts had reopened. While Hector tended to his horses, Mason helped Eleanor clean and rebandage her wounds. The injuries were healing, but slowly, and the rough journey hadn't helped. "We're close," Eleanor said as Mason worked, her voice tight with pain but determined. "By this time tomorrow, the evidence will be in Judge Monroe's hands. This will all be worth it." Mason nodded, though doubt nagged at him. Even with the evidence, bringing down someone as powerful as Judge Prescott wouldn't be easy. And there was still the matter of Samuel Walters, his betrayal, his connection to RKD, his role in Elizabeth's death. "What happens after?" he asked, echoing their conversation from the previous night. "After the evidence is delivered, after Prescott is exposed?" Eleanor studied him, surprise evident in her expression. "You're actually thinking about the future now." Mason secured the fresh bandage, avoiding her gaze. "Just being practical. We should have a plan." "Of course," Eleanor replied, though her tone suggested she didn't believe him. "Well, I'll return to Tucson eventually. Continue investigating disappearances, try to find Margaret and the others if they're still alive. Write the full story for the Star once it's safe to do so." "And if they're not alive?" Mason asked quietly. "If Margaret is gone like Elizabeth," Eleanor's expression faltered, vulnerability showing through her determined exterior. "Then I'll mourn her properly. Give her a funeral, a marker. Move forward somehow." She paused, then added, "What about you? Will you go back to the ranch? Continue writing letters to Elizabeth?" The question hung between them, weighted with implications neither was ready to fully address. "I don't know," Mason admitted. "For 5 years, that's been my whole world. But now," he trailed off, unable to articulate the changes taking place within him. The awakening of feelings he'd thought long dead. The possibility of a life beyond grief and guilt. "Now you're remembering who you were before Eleanor finished for him. The marshal? The man who fought for justice," Mason nodded slowly. "Something like that." Their conversation was interrupted by Hector's return. The wagon driver looked troubled, his weathered face creased with concern. "Riders on the road," he reported, looking in the bushes, checking all hiding places. "They come this way soon." Mason was on his feet immediately, peacemaker in hand. "How many?" "3, maybe 4, Hector replied. "All armed." Mason made a quick decision. "Miss Reed, you and Hector continue to Phoenix with the evidence. I'll create a diversion, lead them away." "Absolutely not," Eleanor protested. "We stay together." "The evidence is what matters," Mason insisted. "Getting it to Judge Monroe. I can buy you time, make sure you get through." Eleanor stood facing him with fierce determination. "And what happens to you? You think I'll just leave you to face them alone after everything we've been through?" Mason met her gaze steadily. "This isn't up for debate. Those documents are the key to bringing down Prescott and RKD, to justice for Elizabeth, for Margaret, for all the others. That has to come first." "And if you're killed," Eleanor challenged, "if Samuel Walters puts a bullet in your back, what justice is there in that?" "Better me than you," Mason replied simply. Eleanor opened her mouth to argue further, but Hector interrupted urgently. "They come, no time for argument." The sound of approaching horses confirmed his warning. Mason made a swift calculation. They couldn't outrun mounted pursuers in the laden wagon, and hiding was no longer an option. Their only chance was to split up to divide their hunter's attention. "Take this," he said, pressing the waterproof pouch containing the documents into Eleanor's hands. "Head for Phoenix on foot through the woods. Stay off the roads. Find Judge Monroe. His office is on Washington Street near the courthouse." Eleanor clutched the pouch, conflict evident in her expression. "Mason, please." "I'll find you," he promised. "In Phoenix. At the courthouse. Just get those documents to Monroe." Before she could protest further, Mason turned to Hector. "Can you create a distraction? Drive your wagon back toward the road. Make it look like you're trying to escape." Hector nodded, determination replacing fear on his weathered face. "See, I can do this. They follow wagon, you escape through trees." "They'll catch you," Eleanor objected. "I tell them I know nothing," Hector said with a shrug. "Just drive her. They find nothing, they let me go." It was a risk, but their options were dwindling by the second. The riders were close now, their voices carrying through the trees as they called to each other, coordinating their search. "Go," Mason urged Eleanor, "now, while they're still on the road." Eleanor hesitated a moment longer, then stepped forward, suddenly pressing a swift, fierce kiss to Mason's cheek. "Don't you dare die," she whispered fiercely. "I'll never forgive you if you do." Before Mason could respond, she was gone, slipping into the trees with the documents clutched to her chest. Hector moved to his wagon, preparing to create the diversion that would hopefully allow both Eleanor and Mason to escape. As the sound of hoofbeats grew louder, Mason positioned himself behind a large boulder. Peacemaker ready. He'd faced worse odds in his years as a marshal. And this time he had something worth fighting for, not just vengeance for Elizabeth, but a future that, for the first time in 5 years, seemed possible. Whatever came next, Mason Hayes was no longer just surviving. He was at last alive again. The forest fell silent as Eleanor disappeared among the trees. For a heartbeat, all Mason could hear was the pounding of his own blood in his ears, the quiet before the storm. Then Hector's wagon lurched into motion, wheels crunching over fallen branches as he drove toward the main road. The diversion had begun. Mason pressed himself against the boulder, peacemaker ready. Raised voices echoed through the trees as the riders spotted the wagon. Hoofbeats thundered closer, then split, some continuing along the road in pursuit of Hector, others crashing through the underbrush toward Mason's position. He held his breath, counting. 2 riders had followed Hector. That left 2, maybe 3, coming his way. A horse snorted nearby, too close. "Tracks here," a voice called. "Someone went into the woods." "Spread out," another voice responded. "They can't have gone far." Mason recognized the second voice instantly. Samuel Walters, his former colleague, now hunter. Slowly, Mason edged around the boulder, staying low, using the forest's dappled shadows for cover. He needed to lead them away from Eleanor's path to buy her time to reach Phoenix with the evidence. A twig snapped beneath his boot. "There," Samuel's voice rang out. "By the big rock." A shot cracked through the forest, splintering bark inches from Mason's head. He ducked and ran, no longer concerned with stealth. Let them follow him. That was the plan. Mason crashed through the underbrush, deliberately leaving a clear trail. Behind him, horses pushed through the trees, gaining ground quickly. He veered west away from the route Eleanor would take to Phoenix, leading his pursuers while in a chase that would hopefully end with just him, not her. Another shot rang out, closer this time. Mason didn't look back. Couldn't afford to. The terrain sloped upward, becoming rockier, less forested. Soon he'd be exposed an easy target on the open hillside. He spotted a narrow ravine cutting across his path, a dry creek bed, steep-sided and deep enough to provide cover. Mason slid down the embankment, sending a shower of loose stones ahead of him. The ravine offered a chance at least to set up an ambush rather than be caught in one. The sound of horses slowed as his pursuers approached the ravine cautiously. Mason pressed himself against the dirt wall, controlling his breathing, listening. He went down there, and an unfamiliar voice said, like a rabbit into a hole. It's Hayes, all right, Samuel responded. I'd know that run anywhere. Bastard always did prefer to flee rather than face consequences. The words stung, but Mason held his position. Let Samuel think what he wanted. It didn't matter now. So we going after him? The first voice asked. You two go around, Samuel ordered. Cut him off at the other end. I'll drive him toward you. Hoofbeats retreated, then returned. A moment later, Samuel's voice called from directly above. I know you can hear me, Hayes. It doesn't have to end with bullets. Come out, tell us where the Reed woman is and what she's carrying, and you can walk away. Mason remained silent, calculating distances, options. The woman's as good as dead anyway, Samuel continued. Dawson wants her personal after what she's done. But you could still have a life, that ranch of yours, those letters to Elizabeth. At the mention of his wife's name, something cold and hard crystallized in Mason's chest. You don't get to speak her name, he called back, breaking his silence. Not after what you did. A pause, then, and what exactly did I do? Hayes, survive, adapt, learn which way the wind was blowing. You betrayed us. Mason replied, anger sharpening his words. The raid. You tipped off RKD. You're the reason Elizabeth died. Samuel's laugh echoed through the ravine, hollow and bitter. Is that what you think, that I betrayed you? A rock skittered down the embankment as he apparently moved closer to the edge. You never could see the bigger picture, Hayes. Never understood how power really works in this territory. Enlighten me, Mason said, shifting his position slightly, trying to locate Samuel by sound alone. Prescott runs everything, Samuel replied. Has for years. The courts, the land office, even the marshal service to some extent. The smart ones figured that out and adapted. The principled ones, he let the sentence hang. Ended up dead, Mason finished, like Elizabeth. Elizabeth was a complication. Samuel acknowledged, his voice suddenly cold. She and that Reed woman's sister, they were asking too many questions, connecting too many dots. Prescott couldn't risk it. The confirmation hit Mason like a physical blow. Elizabeth had been targeted specifically, just as Eleanor had claimed. Not collateral damage in a failed raid, but a deliberate murder. So you arranged it all, Mason said, the pieces finally falling into place. The raid, the ambush. You made sure we'd fail, that Elizabeth would be there. I gave Prescott what he wanted, Samuel agreed. In return, I got to live, to prosper even. Deputy sheriff now, with promises of more to come once the railroad deal is finalized. And how many others died for your prosperity? Mason asked, anger burning hot in his veins. How many lives destroyed? That's business in the territories, Hayes. Always has been. The strong take what they want. The weak lose what they have. It's the natural order of things. Mason had heard enough. Samuel's justifications, his casual dismissal of lives destroyed, it crystallized everything that had gone wrong 5 years ago. Everything that continued to poison the territory like a slow-spreading venom. There's nothing natural about murder, Mason replied, or betrayal. He raised the peacemaker and fired a single shot at the edge of the ravine where Samuel's voice had been coming from. A surprised shout, then the scrabble of boots on loose stone as Samuel apparently fell back. Mason didn't wait to see the result. He moved quickly along the ravine, keeping to the shadows. Samuel's men would be circling around to cut him off, but they'd be expecting him to continue westward away from Phoenix. Instead, he doubled back, climbing the eastern slope of the ravine and slipping into the forest once more. The sound of gunfire would draw the men who'd pursued Hector. Mason needed to move fast to circle around and intercept Eleanor before Samuel's reinforcements could organize a proper search. As he made his way through the forest, Mason's mind churned with Samuel's revelations. Elizabeth had been murdered because of what she knew. Because she and Margaret Reed had been investigating Prescott's connection to the injured women at the hospital. Because they'd been brave enough to ask questions when others looked away. The knowledge fueled Mason's determination. Getting Eleanor and the evidence to Judge Monroe wasn't just about justice anymore. It was about honoring Elizabeth's courage, completing the work she'd begun. The forest thinned as Mason moved eastward, giving way to scattered juniper and scrub oak. Ahead, the terrain sloped toward Phoenix, the city visible in the distance, as a smudge against the horizon. Eleanor would be making for that, staying under cover as much as possible. Mason quickened his pace, alert for any sign of pursuit. The scattered gunfire behind him had ceased, which meant either Hector had escaped or been captured, and Samuel's men were regrouping. Either way, they'd soon realize their quarry had doubled back. The sun climbed higher, heat building as morning gave way to midday. Mason's water was running low, but he pushed on, searching for any sign of Eleanor's passage. She was injured, moving on foot through unfamiliar terrain. He should be able to overtake her before she reached the outskirts of Phoenix. A flash of movement caught his eye, a disturbance in the brush about 50 yards ahead. Mason froze, peacemaker ready, watching. It could be Eleanor, but it could just as easily be one of Samuel's men, or even an animal. The brush moved again, and a figure emerged, Eleanor moving with determined strides despite her obvious exhaustion. Relief flooded through Mason at the sight of her alive and still in possession of the documents. He stepped out from his cover, raising a hand in greeting. "Miss Reed." Eleanor spun toward his, voice tension visible in every line of her body until she recognized him. Relief transformed her face, followed swiftly by concern. "Mason, are you hurt? I heard gunfire." "I'm fine," he assured her, closing the distance between them. "Samuel and his men followed me west. It gave me a chance to circle back." Eleanor studied his face as if confirming for herself that he was truly unharmed. "And Hector?" "I don't know," Mason admitted. "He created the diversion as planned. After that," he shook his head. "We can only hope he got away clean." Eleanor nodded, understanding the sacrifice the wagon driver had made for them. "We should keep moving. Phoenix is still miles away, and they'll realize they've been tricked soon enough." As they continued eastward, Mason recounted his confrontation with Samuel, the revelations about Elizabeth's death, and Prescott's involvement. Eleanor listened in grim silence, the confirmation of her theories, bringing no joy, only renewed determination. "So, it's true," she said when he finished. "Elizabeth and Margaret were investigating Prescott together. They were targeted specifically because of what they knew." "Yes," Mason confirmed. "Samuel, as much as admitted it, said Elizabeth was a complication that Prescott couldn't risk." Eleanor's expression hardened. "Then these documents aren't just evidence of corruption. They're a tribute to your wife and my sister. Proof that what they discovered was real and worth dying for." The perspective struck Mason deeply. For 5 years, he'd seen Elizabeth's death as a tragedy born of his failure. Now he could see it differently, as a consequence of her courage, her refusal to look away from injustice. It didn't lessen the loss, but it changed its meaning in ways that made the burden somehow more bearable. They walked in silence for a time, conserving energy and water as the sun beat down relentlessly. The terrain gradually flattened as they approached the outskirts of Phoenix farms and small homesteads appearing in the distance. "We'll need to be careful entering the city," Mason said as they paused in the shade of a large mesquite tree. "Samuel will have telegraphed ahead. There may be men watching for us." Eleanor nodded, wiping sweat from her brow with a dusty sleeve. "Judge Monroe's office is on Washington Street near the courthouse. If we can get there undetected, we'll be under his protection." "That's a big if," Mason observed grimly. "Phoenix isn't Tucson. There are fewer places to hide, fewer allies to call on." "We've come too far to fail now," Eleanor said, determination evident in her voice despite her obvious exhaustion. "We'll find a way." Mason studied her, noting the pallor beneath her sunburn, the way she favored her injured wrist. She was pushing herself beyond endurance, driven by a commitment to justice that matched his own newfound resolve. "Rest here a moment longer," he said. "I'll scout ahead, find us a safe route into the city." Eleanor nodded gratefully, sinking back against the trunk of the mesquite. Mason left her with his remaining water and moved forward, cautiously staying low and using what cover the scattered vegetation provided. From a rise about a quarter-mile ahead, he could see Phoenix more clearly, a dusty frontier town spreading out along the Salt River. Unlike Tucson with its maze of narrow streets and adobe buildings, Phoenix was newer, more organized, its streets laid out in a grid pattern that offered little concealment for fugitives. Movement at the southern edge of town caught Mason's eye. Riders, several of them, spreading out along the approaches to the city. Samuel's telegram had indeed preceded them. The net was closing. Mason returned to Eleanor, who had managed to doze briefly in his absence. She woke at his approach, instantly alert. "They're watching the approaches to the city," he reported. "At least 6 men that I could see, probably more that I couldn't. We won't be able to walk in unnoticed." Eleanor's face fell, but only momentarily. "Then we don't walk in," she said, determination replacing disappointment. "We ride in." "With what horses?" Mason asked, skepticism evident in his voice. Eleanor pointed to a small farm visible about half a mile to the east. "We buy them, or borrow them if necessary." Mason considered the suggestion. It was risky. Approaching the farm might expose them, and there was no guarantee the farmer would be willing to part with horses, especially to strangers in their condition. But the alternative, trying to slip past Samuel's men on foot, seemed even more unlikely to succeed. "Worth a try," he conceded, "but let me approach alone. You're in no condition to run if things go wrong." Eleanor started to protest, then winced as she tried to stand her injuries and exhaustion, finally catching up to her. "Fine," she agreed reluctantly, "but take the documents. If something happens to you, I can still try to reach Judge Monroe." The trust implicit in her offer touched Mason deeply. He accepted the waterproof pouch, tucking it securely inside his shirt. "I'll be back as soon as I can. Stay hidden." Mason approached the farm, cautiously alert for any sign of danger. It was a modest homestead, a small adobe house, a well-kept barn, fields of corn and beans stretching toward the river. A thin spiral of smoke rose from the chimney, suggesting someone was home. As he neared the house, a dog began to bark, announcing his presence. Mason slowed his approach, keeping his hands visible as the door opened, and a man stepped out, shotgun in hand. "That's far enough, stranger," the man called. He was older, perhaps 60, with a weathered face and the calloused hands of someone who'd worked the land all his life. "State your business." "Need to buy a horse," Mason replied simply. "Maybe two if you have them to spare. I can pay." The farmer studied him suspiciously. "You look like you've been through a war, mister, and there's men riding the perimeter of the city looking for someone. Wouldn't happen to be you, would it?" Mason considered lying, then decided against it. This man had likely lived in the territory long enough to recognize a fugitive when he saw one. "It might be," he acknowledged, "but not for the reasons they'd tell you." The farmer's expression remained guarded, but he lowered the shotgun slightly. "And what reasons would those be?" "My companion and I have evidence of corruption against Judge Prescott of Tucson," Mason said, deciding that honesty was his best chance. "Evidence that could stop the railroad land grab that's been destroying farms like yours across the territory." Something shifted in the farmer's eyes, a flash of recognition, perhaps even hope. "Prescott, you say?" "The same Prescott who's been foreclosing on farms all along the proposed railroad route, who's been using the law to steal land from folks who've worked it for generations." Mason nodded. "The same. We have documents proving his connection to the railroad company, to land seizures, even to violent intimidation of homesteaders who refused to sell." The farmer was silent for a long moment, seeming to weigh Mason's words against his appearance, his desperation. Finally, he lowered the shotgun completely. "My brother lost his farm near Tucson last year," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Worked that land for 30 years, raised his children on it. Then suddenly the bank calls in a loan he never missed a payment on. Next thing he knows, he's out, and the railroad's surveyors are measuring his fields." He spat in the dust. "Broke his heart. He didn't last 6 months after that." Mason said nothing, allowing the man his grief, his anger. "Your companion," the farmer said finally. "Where is he?" "She," Mason corrected. "And she's injured, hiding in the mesquite grove to the west." The farmer nodded slowly. "Bring her here. You'll both need food and rest before you face whatever's waiting in Phoenix." He turned toward the barn. "I've got horses you can use. Not much to look at, but they'll get you where you need to go." Relief washed through Mason. "Thank you, Mr. Harding," the farmer supplied. "Thomas Harding. And don't thank me yet. Getting into Phoenix past those riders won't be easy even with horses." "We'll find a way," Mason assured him. "We've come too far to fail now." As Mason turned to retrieve, Eleanor Harding called after him. "One more thing, stranger. If you do manage to bring Prescott down, make sure my brother's name is remembered. William Harding, one of many who died for that bastard's greed." Mason met the farmer's gaze, understanding the weight of the request. "I promise," he said simply. When Mason returned with Eleanor, Harding welcomed them into his home without question, offering food, water, and a place to rest. His wife, a quiet woman with kind eyes, tended to Eleanor's injuries with a gentleness that brought tears to the younger woman's eyes. As the afternoon waned, they gathered around Harding's kitchen table, planning their approach to Phoenix. A hand-drawn map of the city lay between them, with the courthouse and Judge Monroe's office marked clearly. "The riders are concentrated here," Harding said, indicating the southern approaches. "But the northern route along the river is less heavily patrolled. If you cross here after dark, you might slip through unnoticed." Mason studied the map, considering. "It's risky. The river crossing will slow us down, give anyone watching more time to spot us." "True," Harding acknowledged. "But there's another option. The supply wagon." He pointed to another mark on the map. "Twice a week, a wagon delivers supplies to the courthouse and jail. Food, linens, that sort of thing. It leaves from Miller's General Store on the east side of town around sunset, makes its deliveries and returns. The driver is a friend, Josh Miller, the store owner's son. If I can get word to him, he might be willing to hide you among the supplies." Eleanor leaned forward, hope kindling in her eyes. "That would take us directly to the courthouse, to Judge Monroe." "It's still risky," Mason cautioned. "If your friend is caught helping us, he could face serious consequences." Harding nodded grimly. "Josh knows the risks. His family lost land to Prescott too, though they managed to keep the store. He'll help if I ask." The plan took shape as the afternoon light slanted golden through Harding's windows. The farmer would ride into Phoenix, supposedly on a supply run, and speak to Josh Miller. If Miller agreed, he would collect Mason and Eleanor on his way to the courthouse that evening. If not, they would attempt the river crossing as a backup plan. As Harding prepared to leave, Mason pulled him aside. "I can't thank you enough for this," he said quietly. "You're risking a lot for strangers." The farmer's weathered face creased in a grim smile. "Not for strangers, for justice. For my brother and all the others Prescott has destroyed." He clasped Mason's shoulder firmly. "Just make sure those documents reach Judge Monroe. Make sure this ends." Mason nodded, the weight of responsibility settling over him. "It will end," he promised, "one way or another." After Harding departed, Mason and Eleanor rested, gathering strength for the night ahead. The farmer's wife, Martha, provided clean clothes and a quiet place for Eleanor to sleep, while Mason kept watch from the porch, alert for any sign of approaching riders. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, casting long shadows across Harding's fields, Mason found himself thinking of Elizabeth. Not with the usual ache of loss, but with a sense of continuity of purpose. She had begun this fight 5 years ago, investigating Prescott's connection to the injured women at the hospital. Now he would finish, it would bring to light the corruption she'd glimpsed, would ensure justice for her murder. It felt right somehow, a closing of a circle that had remained painfully open for too long. The sound of hoofbeats roused Mason from his thoughts. He tensed, hand moving to the peacemaker, but relaxed as he recognized Harding returning alone at a steady pace that suggested neither pursuit nor failure. The farmer dismounted wearily, leading his horse to the water trough before approaching the porch. "Miller will help," he reported without preamble. "He'll be passing by the north field in 2 hours on his way to the courthouse. You and the lady need to be waiting by the cottonwood at the fence line. He'll stop long enough for you to climb aboard no longer." Relief washed through Mason. And the city. Any sign of trouble? Harding's expression darkened. "Phoenix is crawling with Prescott's men. They're checking everyone entering or leaving, especially near the courthouse. Miller says Judge Monroe has scheduled a special hearing for tomorrow morning, something about the Railroad Land Commission vote." Mason and Eleanor exchanged glances. The timing couldn't be coincidence. Monroe must have suspicions about Prescott, already suspicions that Eleanor's evidence would confirm. "We need to get these documents to him tonight," Eleanor said urgently. "Before the hearing, before the vote." Harding nodded. "Miller will get you as close as he can. After that, you're on your own." As dusk settled over the farm, Mason and Eleanor prepared for departure. Martha Harding packed them food for the journey, while her husband offered Mason an old revolver to supplement the peacemaker. "Just in case," the farmer said simply. Eleanor had regained some color after her rest, though she still moved with the careful deliberation of someone managing significant pain. The documents remained secure in the waterproof pouch now hidden beneath her borrowed clothes. "If something happens to me," she told Mason as they made final preparations, "promise you'll get these to Judge Monroe. Not just for Elizabeth and Margaret, but for all the others, the Hardings, Maria's son, everyone Prescott has harmed." Mason met her gaze steadily. "Nothing's going to happen to you," he assured her. "We're going to finish this. Together." The conviction in his voice surprised even him. Somewhere in the past few days, amid the danger and revelations, Mason Hayes had rediscovered a part of himself he'd thought lost forever, the part that believed in justice and right and wrong, in standing against corruption, whatever the cost. Elizabeth would have recognized that part of him, would have been proud to see it return. They said their goodbyes to the Hardings as night fell, expressions of gratitude that felt inadequate against the risks the couple had taken in sheltering them. Then, guided only by starlight and the farmer's directions, Mason and Eleanor made their way to the north field, to the cottonwood tree that marked their rendezvous point with Miller's wagon. They settled in to wait silent in the darkness, each lost in private thoughts as the night deepened around them. The documents that could bring down Judge Prescott rested between them, physical proof of corruption that had cost so many lives, destroyed so many futures. "Do you ever think about what comes after?" Eleanor asked suddenly, her voice barely above a whisper in the darkness. "After justice, I mean." Mason considered the question. For 5 years, justice had seemed a distant, impossible dream. Now, with it potentially within reach, the question of what might follow had begun to take shape in his mind. "Sometimes," he admitted, "more lately than before." Eleanor shifted beside him, her face pale in the starlight. "And what do you see when you think about after?" Mason was silent for a long moment. What did he see? A return to the ranch, to solitude and memories? Or something else? Something new, not to replace what he'd lost, but to honor it by living fully again. "I see possibilities," he said finally. "A future not defined by the past, but informed by it. And I see..." He hesitated, then continued more softly. "I see life, Miss Reed, something I haven't truly lived in 5 years." Eleanor's hand found his in the darkness, a brief warm pressure that conveyed understanding without words. "Call me Eleanor," she said simply. "After everything we've been through, I think we've earned the right to first names." Mason nodded, a small smile touching his lips. "Eleanor, then." They lapsed into comfortable silence once more, the tension of the past days easing slightly in this moment of connection. Whatever came next, success or failure, justice or continued corruption, they would face it together, bound by a shared purpose that had somehow, against all odds, become something more. The distant rumble of wagon wheels broke the silence. Mason tensed, alert, as the sound grew closer. A lantern appeared on the road, swinging gently with the motion of the wagon. "That's our ride," he murmured, helping Eleanor to her feet. "Ready." She nodded, determination replacing weariness in her expression. "Ready." They moved toward the road, staying low and watchful. The wagon approached at a steady pace, driven by a young man with a serious face and alert eyes. He slowed as he neared the cottonwood, scanning the darkness. "Miller," Mason called softly. The young man nodded. "Harding sent me. You the ones with evidence against Prescott?" "We are," Eleanor confirmed. Miller gestured to the back of the wagon. "Under the tarp. Make it quick. We're already running late, and that'll draw attention we don't need." Mason helped Eleanor into the wagon, then climbed aboard himself. The cargo area was filled with crates and barrels, supplies for the courthouse and jail as Harding had described. A large tarp covered one section, creating a space just large enough for two people to hide uncomfortably. Stay quiet no matter what happens, Miller instructed as they settled beneath the tarp. I'll get you as close to Judge Monroe's office as I can, but the final approach will be up to you. With that, he returned to the driver's seat, and the wagon lurched forward once more. Mason and Eleanor huddled in the darkness, pressed close, by necessity, the documents secure between them. The journey into Phoenix seemed to take hours, though in reality, it couldn't have been more than 40 minutes. The wagon slowed frequently as they entered the city proper, each pause sending a spike of tension through Mason. Were they being stopped, searched, but each time the wagon continued on after a brief delay. Miller was known to the guards, his deliveries routine and expected. It was their best chance of getting close to Judge Monroe undetected. Finally, the wagon came to a complete stop. Low voices murmured outside, Miller speaking to someone, his tone casual but respectful. "Evening, deputy," they heard him say. "Just the usual delivery for the courthouse and jail. Judge Monroe's working late again, I hear." "That he is," another voice replied. "Special hearing tomorrow got everyone burning the midnight oil. Go on through, but make it quick. We're on high alert tonight." "Trouble?" Miller asked, his tone deliberately disinterested. "Just some fugitives from Tucson," the deputy replied. "Dangerous types. Killed a man, I heard. You see anything suspicious on your way in, you report it immediately, you hear?" "Yes, sir," Miller assured him, though all I saw were coyotes and jackrabbits." The wagon lurched forward again, rolling to a stop a few minutes later. Footsteps approached, and the tarp was pulled back slightly. "We're at the courthouse delivery entrance," Miller whispered. "Judge Monroe's office is on the second floor east wing. There's a guard at the main entrance, but the service stairs should be clear. This is as far as I can take you." Mason nodded, clasping the young man's hand briefly. "Thank you. What you've done tonight, it matters." Miller's serious face softened slightly. "My father always said there are moments when a man has to choose what kind of world he wants to live in. This is mine." He glanced around nervously. "Now go quickly. I'll create a distraction at the main entrance in 5 minutes. Should draw the guard away long enough for you to slip inside." With that, he was gone, returning to the driver's seat. Mason and Eleanor emerged cautiously from their hiding place, finding themselves in a small courtyard behind the courthouse. The service entrance stood a few yards away, a plain wooden door barely visible in the darkness. 5 minutes, Mason whispered, checking the peacemaker. "Then we move." Eleanor nodded, her hand going to the documents hidden beneath her clothes. So close now. After all they'd endured, all they'd risked, Judge Monroe and justice were just one floor away. The minutes crawled by, tension building with each passing second. Finally, a commotion erupted at the front of the courthouse, shouting the sound of something heavy falling. Miller's voice raised in apparent distress. "Now," Mason said, moving swiftly toward the service door. It opened with a soft creak, revealing a narrow staircase used by cleaning staff and delivery personnel. They ascended quickly, Eleanor wincing with each step, but refusing to slow their pace. At the top, another door led to a dimly lit hallway, the east wing of the courthouse where Judge Monroe's office would be located. Mason eased the door open, checking for guards or late working staff. The hallway was empty, doors closed along its length. A brass plaque on one door halfway down read, "Judge Henry Monroe, District Court." Light showed beneath the door. The judge was indeed working late, as Miller had said. Mason and Eleanor approached, cautiously alert for any sound of approaching footsteps. Outside the judge's office, Mason paused, turning to Eleanor. "Are you ready for this?" She nodded, resolve evident in her expression, despite her exhaustion and pain. "More than ready." Mason knocked softly on the door. A moment of silence, then a deep voice called, "Enter." They stepped into a spacious office lined with law books. Behind a massive oak desk sat Judge Henry Monroe, a tall, austere man in his 60s with silver hair and penetrating gray eyes. Those eyes widened in surprise as he took in the disheveled, travel-worn pair before him. "What is the meaning of this?" he demanded, rising from his chair. "Who are you and how did you get past the guard?" "My name is Eleanor Reed," Eleanor said, stepping forward. "I'm a reporter for the Tucson Star, and this is Mason Hayes, former U.S. Marshal." She reached into her clothing, withdrawing the waterproof pouch. "We've come with evidence of corruption against Judge Calvin Prescott of Tucson, evidence related to the Railroad Land Commission vote scheduled for tomorrow." Monroe's expression shifted from outrage to cautious interest. "Evidence? What sort of evidence?" "Documents proving Prescott is the majority shareholder in Arizona Central Railroad Development Corporation," Mason explained. "Proving he's been orchestrating land seizures along the proposed route using both legal mechanisms and criminal intimidation through a gang known as RKD." Monroe's eyebrows rose. "These are serious accusations against a sitting judge." "With serious evidence to support them," Eleanor countered, placing the pouch on his desk. "Land deeds, corporate records, financial transactions, witness testimonies. 5 years of investigation, Your Honor." Monroe studied them both for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he reached for the pouch. "You realize that if these accusations prove false, you could both face charges of slander, perhaps worse." "They're not false," Mason said with quiet confidence. "Prescott's corruption cost my wife her life 5 years ago, Cost Miss Reed's sister hers as well. We didn't risk everything to bring you lies, Your Honor. Something in Mason's tone, the certainty, the barely contained grief, seemed to convince the judge. He opened the pouch, spreading the documents across his desk. For long minutes, the only sound in the office was the rustle of papers as Monroe examined the evidence. His expression grew increasingly grim as he read, occasionally making notes on a pad beside him. Finally, he looked up, decision evident in his stern features. This is indeed troubling evidence. If verified, and I assure you it will be thoroughly examined, it would not only disqualify Judge Prescott from any role in the Land Commission vote, but likely lead to criminal charges. He fixed them both with a penetrating gaze. You understand that bringing this forward puts you in considerable danger. Eleanor nodded. We've been living with that danger since Tucson, Your Honor. Men have already died because of these documents. Then you'll need protection, Monroe decided. I'll have my clerk arrange secure accommodations for you both until the hearing tomorrow. Your testimony combined with these documents should be sufficient to at least postpone the vote pending a full investigation. Relief washed through Mason, not complete victory, but a critical first step. The corruption that had claimed Elizabeth's life would be exposed, examined in the light of justice, rather than hidden in shadows. Monroe moved to a speaking tube on the wall, presumably to summon his clerk. But before he could speak into it, the office door burst open. Samuel Walters stood in the doorway, revolver drawn, two armed men flanking him. I'll take those documents, Judge, he said, his voice hard, and these fugitives as well. Monroe drew himself up to his full height, outrage evident in his bearing. Deputy Walters, this is my chambers. You have no authority to barge in here with drawn weapons. Lower your gun immediately. Samuel's smile was cold. With respect, Your Honor, I have every authority. These individuals are wanted for murder in Tucson. As for the documents, his gaze shifted to the papers spread across Monroe's desk. Those are stolen property evidence in an ongoing investigation. The only investigation these documents pertain to is mine, Monroe replied firmly. And as of this moment, I am ordering you to stand down, Deputy. Whatever jurisdiction you believe you have does not extend to my courtroom or my chambers. For a moment, tension crackled in the air as Samuel weighed his options. Then slowly he lowered his weapon, though he didn't holster it. At least hear what they're accused of, Your Honor, he said, his tone more conciliatory. Eleanor Reed is suspected of breaking into official records in Tucson. Hayes here killed a man outside his ranch, then fled rather than face questioning. They've been running from the law for days. Monroe's gaze shifted to Mason and Eleanor, questioning. The man at the ranch was trying to kill me, Mason said evenly. Self-defense, pure and simple. As for running, he gestured to Samuel. When the law is corrupted, sometimes running is the only way to reach true justice. And the records, Monroe asked Eleanor. My own research files, she replied, removed from my desk at the newspaper where I legally stored them. Monroe considered their responses, then turned back to Samuel. It seems we have conflicting accounts, Deputy. Fortunately, this is a courthouse where such matters can be properly adjudicated. He moved to his desk, gathering the documents into a neat pile. I will take custody of these materials pending tomorrow's hearing. You may present your case against Mr. Hayes and Miss Reed at that time with proper warrants and evidence. Samuel's expression darkened. These fugitives are dangerous, Your Honor. They should be remanded to custody immediately. They will remain under my protection until the hearing, Monroe countered firmly. Unless you wish to explain to the territorial governor why you forcibly removed material witnesses from a federal judge's chambers. It was a standoff judicial authority against corrupted law enforcement. For a long moment, Samuel remained frozen, calculation evident in his eyes. Then abruptly he stepped back. As you wish, Your Honor, he said, his tone falsely deferential. We'll see everyone at tomorrow's hearing. His gaze shifted to Mason, cold and promising. All of us. With that, he and his men withdrew, the door closing behind them with ominous finality. Monroe released a slow breath. That man has no intention of waiting for the hearing, he observed grimly. He'll be back with more men and perhaps a more convincing story. Then we need to secure the documents somewhere safe, Mason suggested. Somewhere even Walters wouldn't dare breach. Monroe nodded thoughtfully. My judicial safe in the courthouse vault. Even with Prescott's influence, Walters wouldn't risk breaking into that. It would end any pretense of legitimate law enforcement. He gathered the documents, returning them to the waterproof pouch. I'll place these there personally. As for you two, we'll need to remain hidden until the hearing, Eleanor finished for him. Somewhere Walters won't think to look. My clerk's residence, Monroe decided. It's here on the courthouse grounds in the East Annex. Walters knows Simmons is a bachelor who lives alone. He won't expect to find you there. It was a temporary solution at best, but it would have to suffice. With the documents secure and the hearing less than 12 hours away, they needed only to survive the night to see justice done. Monroe escorted them personally to the clerk's residence, a modest apartment in the courthouse annex, accessible through a private entrance that bypassed the main building. Simmons, a thin, nervous man with wire-rimmed spectacles, accepted the judge's explanation with surprised compliance, offering his spare room without question. I'll return at dawn to escort you to the hearing chamber, Monroe promised as he prepared to leave. Try to rest. Tomorrow will be eventful. After the judge's departure, Simmons showed them to a small but clean bedroom, apologizing for the limited space. I don't often have guests, he explained, a slight flush coloring his pale cheeks. But please make yourselves comfortable. There's water for washing, and I can prepare some food if you're hungry. Eleanor thanked him with genuine warmth, the first true kindness they'd encountered since leaving the Hardings farm. Mason remained vigilant, checking windows and exits, positioning himself where he could observe the courtyard outside. Samuel wouldn't give up easily, not with so much at stake. And Mason had known the man long enough to recognize the look in his eyes when he'd left Monroe's office, the look of someone calculating odds, weighing risks against rewards. He'll come tonight, Mason said quietly after Simmons had retired to his own room. Samuel, he can't afford to wait for the hearing. Eleanor nodded, unsurprised. What do we do? Be ready, Mason replied simply, and trust that Judge Monroe's authority will hold long enough for morning to arrive. They settled in to wait, too tense for true rest despite their exhaustion. Eleanor sat on the edge of the narrow bed, rubbing her injured wrist absently, while Mason maintained his position by the window, peacemaker ready. Tell me about the ranch, Eleanor said, suddenly breaking the tense silence. What you'll do when you return. After all this is over. Mason glanced at her, understanding the request for what it was, a distraction, a moment of normalcy amid the danger. But also perhaps a way of looking forward, of acknowledging that there would be an after to this long journey. The garden needs attention, he said, allowing himself to envision it. Elizabeth's garden. I've maintained it, but not with the care she would have given it. And the south fence needs replacing. The creek floods every spring, weakens the posts. Sounds like a lot of work for one person. Eleanor observed, her tone carefully neutral. Mason was silent for a moment, considering. Yes, he acknowledged finally. It is. The implication hung between them, unspoken but present. A possibility, a future neither had been ready to articulate, but which had been taking shape in the quiet moments of their journey together. Before either could speak further, a sound from the courtyard drew Mason's attention. Movement in the shadows, figures approaching the annex with deliberate stealth. They're here, he said quietly, moving away from the window. At least 4 of them coming from the east. Eleanor rose immediately, tension replacing the momentary softness of their conversation. Simmons, we should warn him. Mason nodded, moving to the clerk's bedroom door and knocking softly. Simmons appeared almost instantly, as if he'd been waiting sleeplessly for just such a summons. Men outside, Mason explained tersely. Here for us, most likely. Is there another way out? A back entrance? Simmons nodded, his thin face pale but composed. Through the kitchen. It leads to a service alley, then to the street beyond. Good, Mason said. Go now, find Judge Monroe. Tell him Samuel Walters has come for his witnesses. But Simmons shook his head. I can't leave the judicial annex undefended. It's my responsibility as court clerk. This isn't your fight, Eleanor protested. Perhaps not. Simmons acknowledged a surprising firmness entering his voice. But it is my duty. The sanctity of the court must be preserved, especially against those who would corrupt it. He moved to a cabinet, withdrawing a shotgun. This way, please. I'll show you the back exit then. Delay our visitors. There was no time to argue. The sounds from outside suggested Samuel and his men were preparing to breach the entrance. Mason and Eleanor followed Simmons through the small apartment to the kitchen, where a narrow door opened onto a dimly lit alley. The street beyond leads to the main plaza, Simmons instructed. From there you can reach Judge Monroe's residence on Maple Street. He'll know what to do. Thank you, Eleanor said, genuine gratitude in her voice. Be careful. Simmons offered a tight smile. I may not look imposing, Miss Reed, but I've been clerk of this court for 20 years. I know how to protect its interests. He nodded to Mason. Go, I'll hold them as long as I can. As they slipped into the alley, the sound of splintering wood echoed from the front of the annex, Samuel's men forcing their way in. Mason led Eleanor through the darkness, moving as quickly as her injuries would allow, the peacemaker ready in his hand. They had nearly reached the end of the alley when a shotgun blast echoed behind them, followed by shouts and then a second blast. Simmons making good on his promise to delay their pursuers. Keep moving, Mason urged, as Eleanor hesitated, looking back toward the annex. We can't help him now. They emerged onto a quiet street, the main plaza visible a block ahead and illuminated by gas lamps that cast pools of yellow light on the dusty ground. Phoenix slept unaware of the corruption and violence playing out in its courthouse. As they hurried toward the plaza, a figure stepped from the shadows, blocking their path. Samuel Walters, revolver in hand, his expression cold in the dim light. Hayes, he said, almost conversationally. Always running. Some things never change. Mason pushed Eleanor behind him, peacemaker leveled at his former colleague. It's over, Samuel. The documents are in Monroe's judicial safe. By morning, Prescott's corruption will be exposed, and your part in it too. Samuel laughed, the sound empty of humor. You think a few documents will end? This Prescott has judges in his pocket from here to Tucson. Monroe is one man alone in his self-righteous integrity. He'll be overruled, transferred, or worse. Not this time, Mason replied steadily. Too many people know us now. The Hardings, Miller, Simmons. Ordinary people who've lost everything to Prescott's greed. They won't stay silent anymore. Something flickered in Samuel's eyes, doubt perhaps, or the first recognition that the carefully constructed web of corruption might truly be unraveling. But it was quickly replaced by a cold resolve. Then they'll join you, he said, simply raising his revolver. Another tragic frontier shooting. So common these days. Mason tensed, prepared to fire, knowing that even if he fell, Eleanor might have a chance to escape in the confusion. But before either man could pull the trigger, a voice rang out from behind Samuel. That's far enough, deputy. Judge Monroe stood at the entrance to the plaza, a shotgun in his hands. Behind him were several men, citizens of Phoenix, roused from their beds by the commotion at the courthouse, now standing witness to this confrontation. Samuel turned slightly, keeping Mason in his peripheral vision while addressing the judge. This doesn't concern you, Your Honor. Official police business. Threatening witnesses under my protection is very much my concern, Monroe replied, his voice carrying clearly in the night air, as is the attempted breach of my courthouse by armed men without warrants or proper authority. Samuel's confidence visibly wavered as he registered the growing crowd of onlookers. What had begun as a simple elimination of witnesses was becoming a public spectacle, one that couldn't be easily explained away or covered up. Lower your weapon, Deputy, Monroe continued, his tone brooking no argument. Whatever grievance you have with these individuals can be addressed in my courtroom tomorrow with due process and proper evidence. For a moment, Samuel stood frozen, calculation evident in his stance. Then slowly he lowered his revolver, though he didn't holster it. This isn't over, Hayes, he said quietly, for Mason's ears alone. Not by a long shot. With that, he stepped backward, away from Mason and Eleanor, away from Judge Monroe and the gathered citizens. A moment later, he turned and walked swiftly into the darkness, disappearing down a side street. Monroe approached, concern evident in his austere features. Are you both all right? Yes, Mason confirmed, thanks to your timely arrival. Not mine alone, Monroe corrected, gesturing to the men behind him. Mr. Miller here came to my home, warned me of trouble at the courthouse. These good citizens responded to my call for assistance. Josh Miller stepped forward, his serious young face set in determined lines. Couldn't let them stop you, he said simply. Not after everything you've risked to get here. Mason clasped the young man's hand, gratitude beyond words filling him. Your father would be proud, he said quietly. Miller nodded, emotion flickering briefly across his face before he mastered it. The hearing tomorrow, will it stop them, Prescott and the railroad? It will, Monroe assured him. These documents, combined with witness testimony, he glanced at Mason and Eleanor. It's more than enough to halt the Land Commission vote and launch a full investigation into Judge Prescott's activities. Relief washed through the gathered men, ordinary citizens who had suffered under Prescott's corruption, who had watched their neighbors lose land, livelihoods, even lives to his greed and ambition. What about Simmons? Eleanor asked, concern evident in her voice. He stayed behind to delay Samuel and his men. Monroe's expression darkened. We'll check on him immediately, and post guards at the courthouse for the remainder of the night. He turned to the gathered citizens. I need volunteers, men willing to stand watch until morning. Hands raised immediately without hesitation. These were not lawmen or soldiers, just ordinary people, farmers, shopkeepers, laborers. Yet they stepped forward without question, ready to defend justice when official channels had failed. It was Mason reflected a powerful testament to the resilience of community, to the inherent desire for fairness that resided in most people. Given the chance, given the truth, they would stand against corruption, even at personal risk. As Monroe organized the volunteers into watches, Mason found himself wondering if this not vengeance, not even justice in the strictest sense, might be the true legacy of Elizabeth's death. This moment of ordinary courage of community, standing together against those who would exploit and destroy it. Eleanor moved to his side, her expression thoughtful as she observed the scene. This is what she would have wanted, she said softly as if reading his thoughts. Elizabeth, this moment of people reclaiming what was taken from them. Mason nodded, unable to speak past the sudden tightness in his throat. She was right, of course. Elizabeth had always believed in people's capacity for good, for courage, for standing together against injustice. It was why she'd become a nurse, why she'd begun investigating the suspicious patients at the hospital, why she'd risked everything to uncover the truth. In honoring that courage, that commitment, perhaps Mason had found a way to truly honor her memory, not through grief or isolation or even vengeance, but through continuing the work she'd begun, through living as she would have wanted him to live, with purpose, with connection, with hope. As dawn broke over Phoenix, casting golden light across the dusty streets and weathered buildings, Mason Hayes stood on the courthouse steps beside Eleanor Reed, watching as citizens gathered for the hearing that would expose Judge Prescott's corruption and begin the long process of healing the wounds it had inflicted. Samuel Walters was notably absent, having apparently fled in the night rather than face the consequences of his actions. Prescott himself had been summoned from Tucson, unaware of the evidence awaiting him, the witnesses prepared to testify against him. Justice would come, not perfectly perhaps, and certainly not completely. Some wounds could never be fully healed, some losses never truly compensated. But it would come nonetheless, bringing with it the possibility of a better future for the territory and its people. And for Mason Hayes, standing in the morning light with Eleanor Reed beside him, it brought something even more precious. The realization that life continued beyond loss, that purpose could be found again, that hearts believed broken beyond repair could in fact begin to mend. Not a replacement for what had been lost, but a new chapter, a continuation of the story rather than its end. As Judge Monroe called the hearing to order, Mason took Eleanor's hand, a silent acknowledgement of all they had endured together, all they had yet to face. Her fingers tightened around his warm and alive and present. "Ready," she whispered. Mason nodded, feeling the weight of the past 5 years lifting slightly, making room for something new to grow in its place. "Ready," he confirmed. Together they stepped forward into the courthouse, into the light, into whatever future awaited them beyond justice and vengeance and grief. Together they stepped forward into life. Epilogue. 6 months later, Mason Hayes stood on the porch of his ranch house watching the sunset paint the distant mountains in shades of gold and crimson. Elizabeth's garden bloomed beside the house, tended now with the care and attention it deserved. The south fence stood repaired strong enough to withstand the spring floods when they came. Inside, lamps glowed warm against the gathering dusk, and the scent of cooking filled the air. No longer a fortress against the world, the ranch had become a home again, a place of life rather than merely existence. Mason's gaze drifted to the small writing desk, visible through the window, where a leather-bound journal lay open. He still wrote to Elizabeth, sometimes sharing thoughts and memories, keeping her presence alive in his heart. But the letters had changed, focusing now on life continuing, rather than life suspended on growth rather than grief. The sound of hoofbeats drew his attention to the road leading to the ranch. A single rider approached at an unhurried pace, silhouetted against the sunset. Mason smiled, recognizing the straight-backed posture, the confident way she sat in the saddle. Eleanor Reed had changed in the months since the Phoenix hearing. The physical wounds had healed completely, leaving only faint scars as reminders. The deeper wounds, the loss of her sister, the trauma of her captivity, would take longer, perhaps a lifetime. But like Mason, she had found a way to continue living while honoring what had been lost. The Tucson Star now featured her byline regularly, her articles exposing corruption and championing the causes of those without voice or power. Her investigation into the remaining operations of RKD had led to multiple arrests, though Raymond Dawson himself remained at large, presumably having fled the territory. Judge Prescott had not been so fortunate. The evidence presented at the Phoenix hearing, combined with testimony from those he had wronged, had resulted in his removal from the bench and subsequent criminal charges. The Railroad Land Commission vote had been postponed indefinitely, the proposed route reconsidered in light of the illegal land seizures that had facilitated it. Justice had come imperfect, but real. And in its wake, life had continued changed, but unbroken. Eleanor dismounted at the hitching post, removing saddlebags that suggested she planned to stay more than a few hours this time. Her visits had become more frequent over the past months, each one slightly longer than the last, as if both she and Mason were gradually testing the waters of what might be possible between them. Not a replacement for what either had lost, but something new, something unexpected and precious in its own right. "You're early," Mason called as she approached the porch. "Dinner's not ready yet." Eleanor smiled, the expression transforming her serious face, bringing light to eyes that had seen too much darkness. "I brought dessert to make up for it," she replied, patting one of the saddlebags. "Mrs. Harding's apple pie. She sends her regards, by the way. Says the new irrigation system you designed for their farm is working wonders." Mason nodded, pleased. The Hardings had become friends in the months since Phoenix, their farmer, one of many beginning to recover from Prescott's predations. It was a small victory in the larger battle for justice, but a meaningful one nonetheless. As Eleanor climbed the porch steps, Mason noticed a newspaper tucked under her arm. "More exposés on frontier corruption?" he asked. Eleanor's smile faded slightly. "Something else," she said, handing him the paper. "Page 3. Mason unfolded the newspaper, finding the article she indicated. The headline read, "Unidentified woman's body found near border. Possible link to RKD gang." His gaze shot to Eleanor's face, understanding the significance immediately. "Margaret," Eleanor nodded, her expression a complex mixture of grief and relief. "The description matches, and they found this." She reached into her pocket, withdrawing a small silver locket. It was Margaret's, our mother's originally. Mason enfolded her hand in his, the locket, a small hard presence between their palms. "I'm sorry," he said simply. "I knew," Eleanor admitted quietly low. "In my heart, I think I always knew she was gone, but now," she drew a deep breath, "now I can mourn her properly. Give her a proper burial, a marker with her name. Move forward somehow." The echo of their conversation before the Phoenix hearing wasn't lost on Mason. She had known even then that this moment might come, had been preparing for it in her own way. "Will you go to identify her?" he asked. Eleanor nodded. "Tomorrow. It's a 2-day ride to the border." She hesitated, then added, "I was hoping you might come with me, if you can spare the time from the ranch." The request was significant, not just for the practical support during a difficult journey, but for what it represented. A willingness to share grief, to allow another person into that most private of spaces. A trust that went beyond their shared pursuit of justice into something more personal, more intimate. "Of course," Mason said with a weird hesitation. "We'll leave at first light." Relief softened Eleanor's features. Thank you. They stood together on the porch as darkness fell, the first stars appearing in the vast Arizona sky. Neither spoke for a time, content in the silence that had become comfortable between them. I've been thinking, Eleanor said finally, about what comes next, after the burial, after this chapter closes. Mason turned to her, curious. And what have you decided? That I'm tired of just passing through, she replied, her gaze steady on his. Tired of always being on the move, always chasing the next story, the next injustice. That perhaps it's time to put down roots somewhere. A small smile touched her lips. Somewhere with a view of mountains that catch the light at sunset. The implication was clear. The invitation gentle but unmistakable. Not a replacement for what either had lost, but a new beginning. A choice to move forward together rather than apart. The garden could use another pair of hands, Mason said, after a moment, his voice rough with emotion. And the house has always been too big for just one person. Eleanor's smile deepened, reaching her eyes. Is that a yes, Mason Hayes? Mason took her hand, the silver locket still clasped between their palms, a tangible connection to the past. They both carried the losses that had shaped them, but no longer defined them. It's a yes, Eleanor Reed, he confirmed, a beginning rather than an ending. As they stood together in the gathering darkness, the ranch house glowing warm behind them, Mason thought of the letter he'd written to Elizabeth the night before. Words of gratitude for the love they'd shared, for the purpose she'd given him, even in death. Words acknowledging that his heart, once thought permanently broken, had somehow found room to love again, without diminishing what had come before. Not a replacement, a continuation, a life reclaimed from grief and guilt and isolation. As Eleanor leaned against him, her head resting on his shoulder, Mason Hayes felt something he'd thought lost forever: peace. Not the empty quietude of his years alone, but true peace, the knowledge that whatever came next, they would face it together. Some men don't die from bullets, he reflected, watching the stars emerge above the mountains Elizabeth had loved. They die from silence, from holding in things they should have shouted, from walking past what they should have faced. But some men, against all odds, find their way back to life, find their voice again, their courage, their capacity for connection and hope and love. Some men, like Mason Hayes, find their way home.